Welcome. Find a comfortable seat. Let the lights dim to a gentle amber and breathe with me, slow in and out. Tonight we're travelling by lamplight through 20 taverns of the medieval world, places where hunger became fellowship and thin coins bought warm hours, roadside inns and harbour rooms, guild halls and cave cellars, bread that cracked like good news, stews persuaded by patience, ales, wines and meads that carried the memory of fields, vines and bees. You'll hear the quiet grammar of benches and bowls, the soft law of kindness disguised as rules. The wettest cloak gets the peg by the door. Quarrels must pay for bread, and the way towns taught their weather to behave indoors. We'll drift with sailors in Bristol and Lübeck, taste beech-smoked malt in Bamberg, feel liturgy turn to hospitality in Avignon, learn the cold clarity of Prague's cellars, the salt arithmetic of La Rochelle, the honeyed courage of Novgorod, the paprika heat of Buda, and at the last, the sandstone hush of a Nottingham cave, where ale keeps the temperature of stone. Our pace will be slow, warm, and steady. 20 small harbours for the mind, each a room that knows how to let the day loosen its shoulders. Let the kettle hum in the background of your thoughts. Let the night arrange your breathing. If a story pauses, that is on purpose. If a sentence trails into a doorway, it is only inviting you to rest there a moment. We begin with part 1. The tabard, Southwark, about the year 1387, where the road to Canterbury gathers itself in the firelight, stew lifts its quiet steam, and a first cup of ale teaches the tongue how evening should speak. The room is warmer than the street, and the street is already a rumour of hooves, wet cloaks, and the patient river turning in its sleep. Inside, beams the colour of old bread hold a ceiling, rubbed smooth by smoke. The air tastes faintly of burnt rosemary and malt, and somewhere a ladle rings against an iron pot with the soft authority of a bell. He steps in, the way any traveller does, half hope, half fatigue, and the door closes behind him like a good story closing its first comma. There is stew tonight, thick with onions and modest cuts that have been made tender by time and quiet heat. Barley has given its small strength to the broth, and a rind of cheese waits beside a stubby knife, the world reduced to a ritual that the body understands better than the mind. A tavern like this is more than a business. It is a kind of choreography, the host with a face learned in miles, the bench that forgives a muddy hem, the hearth that makes a citizen of the coldest stranger. And then there is ale, amber, a little cloudy in the firelight, cool from a storage room that keeps its own season, poured with the practiced tilt that leaves just enough lace along the rim to make evening feel ceremonial. Some nights the tables are a parliament of trades, a cord wainer with leather dust still in his hair, a clerk who carries his ink on his fingers like proof of occupation, a rider whose boots tell of road work more honestly than any word could. But tonight the room is gently ruled by the low excitement of departure. Pilgrims, soft with anticipation, trade details like talismans, who has heard of a relic at Rochester, whose cousin swore the ford near Sittingbourne swallows mules after rain, which saint listens best if one promises a candle twice a year. A woman in a wimple ties and reties the strap of her pouch. A miller's laugh beats time for a tale he is about to tell, and the innkeeper, part magistrate, part stage director, moves through reed light and shadow, deciding with a glance which table needs mending, which mood needs quieting, which guest requires the better blanket. The sign outside, a tabard, painted bold, creaks whenever the wind remembers it. The name has pulled people here the way a well pulls a village, and it is not a stretch to imagine that long after tonight someone will take these tones and set them in a book, preserving the smell of this room with the alchemy of words. He notices how the light falls, How a candle assigns importance not by rank but by nearness, making a shoelace into a horizon and a bowl into an evening sky. Knives are shared, bread is broken, and the ale turns conversation into a river with many small inlets. A poor spoonful of quiet descends whenever a door opens and admits the rain. The rain is a traveller too, and the hearth makes space for it, sizzling a polite reply each time a drop tries to join the soup. The floor knows the grammar of feet, the stamp of men returning from the stable, the careful shuffle of someone balancing a tray, the absent-minded sway of a man counting coins with his whole body. In the corner, a player tunes a stringed instrument that has already learned humility from weather and work. The note he finds is not loud, only accurate, and accuracy in such rooms is a kind of mercy. There are rules here, though few are written. No one talks louder than the fire, unless danger requires it. Those who arrive late eat what remains without making it smaller with complaint. The sick are given the seat closest to warmth and are asked no questions for a while. Shoes are placed under seats, as if they need to hear the stories too. A travelling friar says grace with a voice that remembers both famine and harvest, and in the pause after Amen, the entire room seems to decide wordlessly to be gentler. Someone passes a jug. Someone else passes judgment on the weather, which accepts the verdict and keeps raining anyway. Overhead, the timbers keep their own counsel, offering the occasional creak as if to remind everyone that wood too is a pilgrim, taken from one life into another. He eats slowly, the stew persuades, the bread consoles, the ale tells the truth, but in a forgiving accent. Across the table, a man confesses he is walking not for piety, but for the hope that distance can outpace regret, and no one laughs at him, because night has a way of educating even the proudest heart. The inn's hounds, diligent, democratic, make their rounds, collecting affection, like taxes payable, in scratches behind the ear. In the stable, horses remark to one another in the eternal language of forage and company. Their breath becomes small clouds that travel only inches and yet seem grateful for the journey. The world outside narrows to lanes, puddles and choices. The world inside expands to include every life one could have lived if one had arrived here earlier or later or with different company. Toward the back, a ledger waits, under the weight of a pewter cup, names, marks, the occasional drawing of a cart or a thistle, evidence that a road is also a library. He thinks of how to measure a place like this, not in pints poured, but in arguments diffused, not in coins counted, but in shoulders unknotted, not in beds filled, but in the number of mornings that felt less like a test after a night spent under this roof. And he understands why such inns gather stories the way cloisters gather prayers. The practicalities are unromantic, cleaning the trenches, skimming the scum from a boiling pot, chasing out the draft that sneaks in like an unpaid guest, but the sum exceeds the parts. Here, logistics becomes tenderness, a bench scrubbed becomes an invitation, a bucket emptied becomes a promise, a fire banked for the small hours becomes a covenant between strangers who will never learn each other's childhood names. Near midnight, the room gentles. A few fall asleep almost upright, their dreams borrowing the tavern's furniture. The chair becomes a hillside, the hearth becomes a road, the table a map that knows the way home. The host makes a final round, practicing the old arithmetic of mercy. Who needs water at the bedside? Who must be awakened before dawn to catch the tide? Who should be left undisturbed to learn the secret lesson that only the last hour of night can teach? He steps out to the yard. The river is a black ribbon, without need of music. The sign creaks a blessing. Somewhere, beyond the bend, bells will greet a morning that will ask new questions in an old order. Pay the ostler, lace the boot, shoulder the pack, begin. He returns inside, and the door admits him as if it had been waiting, which, in a sense, it had. Tomorrow this warmth will be a memory carried carefully, like a coin in a mittened hand, spent in the rain and replenished in the next room with a roof and a name. For now, the candles gutter toward their soft conclusions, writing the last sentences in smoke. And beyond the bridge, beyond the marsh path where lanterns walk like cautious stars, another city keeps its own benches and bowls. York, with its tight lanes and working laughter, already breathing quietly, as if it expects new footsteps by morning. Part 2. We drift now to the craftsman's alehouse along York's shambles, where lanterns breathe on butchered timbers and the street keeps its narrow, ancient throat. The lane is a ribbon of wood and stone so close that neighbours can shake hands from window to window, and beneath those jutting eaves the night gathers like a cloak, smelling of tallow, wet leather, and the insistent comfort of warm grain. Inside the alehouse the beams are low and dark with the long patience of smoke. A rush-strewn floor softens the day's hard footsteps. A hearth persuades the cold to behave. The room has learned the body's grammar, benches that allow the back to forgive its burdens, tables burnished by 1,000 elbows that once measured cloth, hammered copper, counted nails. Here the shambles thins its harsher vowels into murmurs, a carver's thumb bandaged with linen and good humour, a tanner with rain in his hair and oak bark in his sleeves, a girl who knots apron strings with the economy of those who work and sing at the same time. The ale arrives in honest workman-like cups, faintly cloudy, cheerful with malt and a hush of bitter, poured from a cask that knows the cool of an earth-walled cellar. There is bread with a hard crust, like a promise kept, a slab of cheese that tastes of meadows far beyond the city walls, and a stew that taught onions how to be sweet. News moves from lip to lip like a small river that refuses to flood, whose guild admitted a new hand, which arch of the bridge needs a mason's prayer, how the northern wind has been rough with traders on the Ufer. A woman turns a spit, her forearm bright with heat. A boy carries trenches with the swift gravity of one apprenticed to usefulness. The host, soft-eyed and fox-wise, makes circuits of the room, reading the temperature of each table the way a shepherd reads weather on a hill. And because the shambles is famously practical, kindness here arrives dressed as logistics, a dry place to set boots, a lid on the pot so the draught is civil, a clean knife passed without ceremony, each act an unboasted vow that the night will not chew its guests. Past the door, the lane's gutters mutter the old rain. Inside, the low ceiling makes a chapel of conversation, blessing small talk and old jokes with equal liturgy. Somewhere, a fiddle whispers 3 notes and then thinks better of it, preferring the company of the room's natural music. Spoons tapping bowls, a stool's gentle complaint, the lullaby rhythm of mugs set down with satisfied care. There are rules here, and they feel like courtesy rather than law. The apprentice speaks after the journeyman, yet both laugh in the same paragraph. No one quarrels with the fire. A good story is given space to unfold, even if it limps. The alehouse understands sorrow and refuses to panic. It sets a second bowl before a widow and asks nothing. It finds an extra scarf for a man whose rent is late. It forgives mud. If this gentle cadence is carrying you along, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. And if the night feels kinder in this company, you're welcome to subscribe to the entire history, so our paths can cross again in these quiet hours. Lamps flare, then calm, a draught slips under the door like a shy cat and is tamed by the hearth. Old timber gives a satisfied sigh, as if it has counted itself and found nothing missing. Above the rafters, the city dreams its practical dreams, vats that will need stirring by dawn, hides that will want turning, loaves that must be scored like careful maps. And yet a softness threads the room, fatigue folding into fellowship, solitude learning the trick of second person, until even the street's rough trade smells like endurance, not cruelty. Coins clink with the humility of tools. Gestures grow round, unpointed. The room becomes a held breath before sleep, the kind that forgives the day by refusing to repeat it. A man at the end of the bench says he has never seen the sea, and the table, as if remembering a childhood, grows attentive. Someone describes the taste of salt on wind. Another speaks of ropes that creak like old friends. Another names a harbour where gulls carve sermons from the air. The alehouse listens, pleased by the thought of waters it will never drink. And outside, the ooze rewrites the moon into the simplest language it knows. Moving light, going somewhere. When the candles gutter and the lock finds its quiet geometry, feet carry their owners home through the close-lipped street, past hooks and shutters and signs that dangle like punctuation in a sentence the city has been writing for centuries. And far to the west, where the river will one day remember the sea, a different room waits with salt on its tables and rumours in its cups. Bristol, perhaps, leaning into the dark with the patience of ships not yet unmoored. Part 3, we step into a sailor's tavern at Bristol's tide-worn docks, about the year 1410, where rope and salt speak first, and the floorboards know the gait of men who've bargained with weather. The door yields to a smell that has learned many alphabets: tar and oakum, pickled herring, damp wool, and the peppery breath of strong ale, kept cool in cellars that remember winter better than calendars do. Lamps swing with the shy authority of the harbour wind. Their little circles of light travel across faces browned by latitude and nights without enough softness. The room is a map that learned to be a hearth, tables scarred like coastlines, a bar that could be a key, benches that let a back surrender its stubbornness without losing its dignity. Here talk drifts like tidewater, low, repetitive, carrying rumour the way a current carries bits of far coasts, news of the Huns, of prices for waxen furs, of a Breton captain who swears the moon itself is a kind of compass if you are patient with its moods. A stew claims the centre with quiet gravity, thick with barley and long simmered bones, whose lesson is that time can be turned into nourishment. A platter of salted fish bright as a small argument, bread whose crust crackles like kindling. Ale arrives not as an event, but as a continuance, a cloudy brown poured with a turn of the wrist that says the tapster has practiced the same motion through storms of quarrel and celebrations that would have ended badly if the room had not decided to be kind. Close to the hearth, a sailmaker lays out a piece of canvas and mends by lamplight. Every stitch is a little oath taken against future weather. Beside him, a boy, ship's servant, counts the knots in a coil with the tender suspicion that numbers might be prayers in disguise. A clerk from the customs house drinks slowly each swallow an erasure of the day's columns. He listens more than he speaks, as men who know the price of everything often must in rooms where price is only one grammar among many. A singer tries 3 bars of an old tide song and lets it fall, content to hum no louder than a kettle. The melody settles into beams that have already heard better versions from throats, brined by longer voyages. Out in the roadstead, hulls groan and correct themselves. Inside, chairs answer with their smaller, homelier creaks, domestic cousins to ocean sounds. This tavern has rules the harbour understands. No one interrupts a man who is learning to be silent. Arguments must be paid for with the next round. The wettest coat hangs closest to the door, so the room can cure it gently by degrees. When a gust shouldered the door and the lamps leaned, hands rose to steady them without looking, as if the whole room were a crew, and flame itself a rigging to be trimmed. There is danger in the stories, but only the remembered kind, which is softer. A pilot tells of a sandbank that moves as if it had a will. A fish street widow describes a winter when the Seven locked its jaw on ships and would not let them go until the town bribed it with patience. The tavern hears and nods. Between the sips, it teaches its favourite lesson, that survival is a choreography of small tasks done in unshowy sequence. Oil the block, roll the cask, share the knife, bless the hands that bake at dawn. If this gentle pace is helping you drift, tell me where you're listening from and what time it has become on your side of the night. And if these harbours keep you company, you're warmly invited to subscribe to the entire history so our lanterns can find each other again. Toward closing, the room takes on that kind of mercy only ports know. Men who shout on decks speak in lowercase. A quarrel remembers its manners and turns into a card game. The tapster slides a bowl to a stray cat whose ears have learned the weather forecast better than flags. Someone chalks a departure on a beam. Hull tomorrow? Calais when the wind forgets its temper, and closes the chalk with a thumb as if to seal a letter. Coins clink. Ropes on the wall cast small braided shadows like blessings. The stew pot sighs and becomes an ember of smell. He steps outside a moment, and the harbour is a book left open at the same sentence for centuries. Mastheads pricking the dark, the slow conversation of hull and water, the moon sulking behind cloud, as if it would rather be a lantern in here than a god out there. Beyond the quayside, the road to London thinks about waking, and somewhere east, under market stars and a more theatrical signboard, a city alehouse waits, where laughter comes quicker and wine arrives with stagecraft, the Boar's Head in Eastcheap, already clearing its throat for the evening's brighter kind of sea. Part 4. We ease into the Boar's Head at Eastcheap, where theatre and supper share a stage, and the city teaches its best lessons in warmth and shadow. A painted sign swings like a cheerful verdict above the street, and when the door yields, it is to a light that behaves like music, quick here, slow there, never quite finishing a note. The room wears its reputation the way an old actor wears a beloved costume, with ease rather than vanity. Oak settles underfoot with small companionable sounds. Rushes soften the edges of the day. A long board presents its evening thesis. Trenches steaming. A boar's jowl lacquered by patience. Onions turned, sweet enough to forgive their tears. A loaf whose crust cracks like polite laughter. Wine shows up in a mood to be sociable, ruddy as a good blush. Ale answers in earthier terms from casks that remember cool cellars and steady hands. At one end, a brazier glows, like a rumour that happens to be true. At the other, a player's stool is pulled near the hearth, as if to suggest that stories and heat rise from the same source when a city wishes to be kind. Eastcheap is a district built to argue and embrace in the same hour, and the Boar's Head is its chapel. Merchants who learned arithmetic from tides and risk, archers with shoulders that keep old weather, apprentices whose pockets jingle with a future not yet convinced. Two women from the market who have outbargained a dozen men by noon and now accept their victory in cups and comfortable chairs. The room speaks several dialects, all of them famished: dockyard, guildhall, playhouse, parish, and they cross the table gracefully, tripping only when a joke refuses translation and must be demonstrated with a wooden spoon. The host is a conductor who uses ladles instead of a baton. The serving girl who knows every regular by the way he pushes his cup forward. The tapster listening to foam as if it were a witness. The carver reading the roast with the tenderness of a scholar handling manuscripts. Shadows move like audiences, approving. Above the hearth a platter bears the painted head of a boar, with eyes that seem to understand both satire and appetite. Someone has tucked a sprig of rosemary behind its ear, as if to bless the room with a small edible benediction. Stories arrive as courses. A guardsman reenacts a parade in 3 gestures and lets the gravy finish the description. A clerk claims he has seen a comet large enough to embarrass the moon. A girl from Billingsgate names each fish she handled at dawn and makes the list sound like a rosary said for the river. Laughter collects in the rafters like a second thatch, insulating the night from what the city's colder corners might yet demand. There is music, but only as much as the room can carry without spilling. Lute and voice, a whistle that knows when to be quiet. Somewhere a pair of friends argue over which wine has the better accent. They lose the argument on purpose because it is a pleasant thing to do. Rules exist, but they behave like courtesies rather than laws. The loudest man must pay for the next round. News that can wound is deferred until morning. Benches make room for one more, and if none is left, a knee will lend itself as a brief stool. A woman who enters alone is met with the kind of attention that understands dignity, is not a favour to be granted, but a fact to be kept. On cold nights, the windows mist, and the world outside grows vague, as if Eastcheap itself were an anecdote told by the fire. The city listens at the panes and approves the sound of its own heart. Between plates, the room remembers it is a stage. A boy recites a speech learned by ear from a troupe that passed through last week. He gets a phrase wrong and improves it by accident. A man with a soldier's haircut plays a fool's part so gently that sorrow forgets its lines and leaves through the kitchen door. 2 old friends attempt a dance that was never fashionable and is perfect tonight. The boar's head does not scold time for moving. It pours another cup and asks it to stay a little. 2. And because we are moving at a pace meant to cradle, if this soft hour is keeping you company, tell me where you're listening from and what the clock says over there. And if the glow of rooms like this feels like a harbour you'd like to find again, you're welcome to subscribe to the entire history, so our lanterns can greet each other in the nights ahead. The roast yields its last. The trenches are cleared, with the reverence due to good endings, and somewhere in the back a ledger closes with a friendly thud, the account balanced not only in coins, but in the subtle surplus of an evening well shared. Out in Eastcheap, hawkers are inventing tomorrow's voices. In here, candles tremble toward a grammar of sleep. The floor reconsidered its knots into constellations. Beams remember the hands that raised them. The sign outside turns in a private wind and blesses latecomers with the squeak of its hinge. When closing peels the room away from talk, the host makes that final, merciful round, a wedge of bread tucked into a pocket that does not want charity, a jug of water for the road because wine should not be asked to keep a man upright beyond its vocation, a gesture toward the hearth for those who must leave it slowly. Chairs are nudged closer to the table, as if to make the room smaller and safer for the ember's last watch. The door opens, and London exhales, spice and wet stone, the river mumbling its old sermon, a cart's iron rim declaring its argument with cobble. And as the street takes us back, The city rearranges its stages for tomorrow, markets combing their hair, steeples rehearsing their vowels, bridges buttoning their coats. Far down river, beyond the bend where the wind practices being mischievous, another threshold waits with a different quiet, Clooney's guest house cloistered and orderly, where wine behaves like liturgy, and bread is the civil cousin of prayer, and where the night will learn a slower language for its hunger. Part 5. We arrive at a pilgrim's inn in Burgos, on the long Camino, where footsteps learn to speak in beads of dust, and supper tastes like a prayer that has remembered the poor. Stone holds the evening with monastic patience. The archway is low enough to teach humility, and the courtyard keeps a small well at its quiet centre, as if thirst were a guest too. Inside, benches are set close, elbows comfortable in neighbouring lives. A trestle table runs the length of a story the road never finishes. The host is sun-browned and brisk, a steward of appetites who has learned the arithmetic of mercy. One ladle more, when the eyes say less, a wedge of bread cut thinner so it can become sufficient by kindness. Bowls arrive steaming with arjo, garlic soup that convinces the body it can forgive its own mileage, alongside anchovies shocked from salt into tenderness with oil and a sly squeeze of lemon. A clay jug carries Castilian wine that remembers hills the way a hymn remembers breath. Boots sleep under seats like tired animals. Scallop shells knock softly from belts and packs, the portable heraldry of hope. Dust settles into hems and becomes part of the fabric, geography stitched to intention. Outside, the abbey bells ration the dark. Inside, spoons knock a homely music from earthenware, and conversation braids itself into a rope strong enough to pull the mind across tomorrow's miles. The room is rich with nationalities that have decided for a handful of nights to be a single grammar. A Breton's rolled R, a Gascon's sunlighted vowels, a woman from the Rhineland who has taught her feet to keep a secret. They trade cures and cautions with the same tender pedagogy. A smear of lard for blisters. Avoid the ford after rain. Do not promise heaven a grand vow you cannot keep, but bring it the small, honest coin of repeated steps. A boy moves between benches, holding a basket as if it were a reliquary. He offers almonds, olives, the shy luxury of figs. On a shelf, a ledger waits with its spare script, names, dates, distances guessed at by the wobble of the hand, proof that the world, at walking speed, can be converted into hospitality. There are rules here made of consideration rather than ink. The last to arrive eats first. Shoes that bite are loosened by neighbours without questions. Snoring is not a sin if the day earned it. The poorest bed is warmed with extra wool, and stories, even the miraculous kind, are served in small portions so the night does not choke on wonder. Near the hearth, a woman with a pilgrim's badge of lead, St. James stamped like a moon, teaches a new friend how to thread a needle through skin without arguing with pain. Her voice is a country road that refuses drama. A mason from Leon explains the cathedral's ribs with hands that cannot stop building. He curbs his pride when he notices a shepherd listening as if a roof were something you could graze. In a corner, a man who used to speak loudly learns the hush of listening, while a tired priest says grace in syllables so simple they seem borrowed from the bread. The wine is not grand, which is one of its virtues. It remembers sunlight without becoming arrogant. It blesses the cheeks into friendliness and then steps back. Polite, toward the door, two elders argue about the route past Castro Sherries. They decide, as good pilgrims do, that both can be right if they rise early enough. The inn's dogs collect confessions without keeping them. Their eyes promise to forget at dawn. Later, when lamps lift their little halos above bowls and shoulders, The room turns to the curriculum of endurance. A woman shows the trick for lacing sandals so the heel does not sulk. A man teaches a knot for carrying a bundle without teaching the back resentment. Someone rewraps a knee and declares, with the authority of the unimportant, that tomorrow's descent is kinder than the map admits if you breathe like a bellows and allow the path to explain itself. If this gentle pace is keeping you company, if the Camino's music of spoons and soft footsteps has found you, tell me where you're listening from and what hour your window keeps. And if you'd like these quiet rooms to find you again at the edge of sleep, you're warmly invited to subscribe to the entire history so we can meet in the lamplight of future nights. The stars over Burgos practice their plainchant. Inside, the last crusts surrender their assignments. The jug finds its echoing bottom and does not complain. Someone begins a hymn, stops, and smiles at the notion that God might prefer the silence after soup. Packs are stacked like small cities. Staffs lean against the wall like patient exclamation points, refuse their urgency. The host makes a final round with water, with blankets, with that pragmatic tenderness particular to roads. Sleep on your left, stretch the calves, rise before doubt wakes. He closes shutters that keep out more than wind. The room eases into the shared breath of strangers who will remember each other only as silhouettes of kindness. Someone who lent a pin, someone who traded a fig for a laugh, someone who listened when a memory needed to cross the night. When the last lamp thumbs out, the floor holds the day one more minute and then releases it. Beyond the gate, the way unrolls into a grey promise. Fields like folded cloaks, bridges rehearsing their manners, milestones becoming gentle commas in a sentence. The morning will continue. And north, over ranges where cold thinks in Latin and stone keeps accounts, a different welcome prepares itself. A guest house kept by men who water their vineyards with silence. Cluny, where bread is measured by bells, and wine behaves like liturgy, already setting a place for those who carry the dust of far roads in the cuffs of their sleep. And part 6, we cross a threshold in Burgundy, where the night moves at the pace of bells, into a monastic guest house near Cluny, where bread is a civil prayer and wine keeps the memory of sunlight without boasting. Stone receives footfall the way a lake receives dusk, without argument, with a patience that has learned the arithmetic of centuries. The cloister's walk is a low murmur of arches. Their shadows gather like robed listeners who prefer to let silence have the first and last word. At the door, a brother inclines his head, not as a shopkeeper does, but as one who understands the hospitality is a form of governance, quiet, exact, merciful in the details. He notes mud and fatigue, the way a scribe notes marginalia, not to scold, but to account for what the text of the evening will require. Reeds sweeten the floor. The air carries a small museum of scents, baked rye, beeswax, damp wool, a far memory of crushed grapes asleep in the cool. In the refectory, the tables are long enough to discourage pettiness. Benches invite spines to remember that uprightness and rest can be cousins. A candle is set between every two bowls, not to flatter faces, but to make neighbours of them. The room has learned to be handsome without vanity. Whitewashed walls, a crucifix carved plain as good advice, shelves of pottery that accept chips as biography rather than flaw. Supper arrives with a modest ceremony that somehow enlarges the appetite without exciting it. A loaf is broken, not cut. The fracture makes a sound as soft as a page turning. Soup follows, barley and root, the humility of gardens translated into warmth. It tastes of weather told truthfully and salt used with the wisdom of restraint. A pale cheese, rind like a quiet country road, yields under a knife that has been sharpened for usefulness rather than display. Wine appears in earthen jugs that cool the hand, poured with a turn of the wrist, learned from years of pouring for men who rise before dawn. It wears a thin halo at the lip that the candlelight blesses, then forgets. No one here speaks of pairing. The food knows its friends without being told. A brother reads from a book. His voice steps through syllables the way a gardener steps through a row, careful not to bruise. Sometimes the reading is a psalm, sometimes a scrap of homily or travels of a saint. Sometimes, when famine has been near enough to be considered a neighbour, the passage is a list of names, and the room eats more slowly out of respect. Rules breathe under everything, light as linen. Wash before you eat, take what you need, and no portion of display. The stranger receives the warmer place near the fire. The sick are not allowed to apologize. Even the knives obey mercy, broad-tipped and utilitarian, more interested in division, made useful than in any sharp remark. Trenches are scoured till the wood shows its grain like patient handwriting. Jugs are rinsed in a basin that has heard the confidences of countless evenings and keeps none of them. In a corner, a brother oils the hinges of the outer door, explaining to a novice, with the pedagogy of small tasks, that a soft hinge is also a prayer for those who wake in the night and would go out to speak privately with the stars. Linen hangs to dry by the bakery's mild heat. Its whiteness is not a performance, but a promise. In the infirmary, bitter herbs soften their bitterness for the sake of those who will drink them, because hope, too, has a taste that must sometimes be acquired. Talk is permitted after the reading only in a register that would not frighten a child. Stories, when they happen, wear work clothes. How the vines took frost and then forgave it. How a cart lost a wheel at the ford and a town found a way to arrive as a single helpful body. How a pilgrim, despairing at noon, remembered at vespers. That despair is not a destination, but merely a place the tide often misread. The guest house gathers such accounts like a beehive takes clover, without fuss, turning each small floral truth into something that keeps. A traveller from the Rhone speaks softly of currents. A mason from Autumn traces a rib vault in the air with 2 fingers, and then laughs at himself for wanting heaven to notice. A widow sets down her spoon and calls the soup decent, which in this company is praise unadorned and therefore heavy with sincerity. The brothers listen, the way old orchards do, with the patience of trunks that have held winters, with branches skilled in making shade that does not feel like refusal. Later, bowls are stacked with the same attention they were filled. Crumbs are gathered into the hand because waste is a kind of bad grammar. The brother on dishes sings under his breath. The melody is neither secular nor sacred exactly, but it knows how to carry weight without complaint. Outside the night catalogues itself, owl, distant water, wind making a small negotiation with the cypress. Bells mark the hour as if time were a guest who must be offered regular kindness lest it turn cruel. In the dormitory, the beds are narrow, the blankets generous. Fatigue climbs in and finds that for once it is the one being carried. Somewhere a lamp keeps its watch, a small sun entrusted with a universe the size of a room. Those who have walked all day discover that the silence here has backbone. It holds them rather than merely surrounding them. Sleep arrives like a host with good manners, at the right time, without flourish, attentive to departures. If the world were to ask what is taught in such a house, the answer would come dressed as chores. That bread is a technology of patience. That water keeps its promises if handled with respect. that floors do not remain clean on their own, and neither do thoughts. That hospitality, measured, rhythmed, repeated, can turn strangers into a we. The guest house does not oppose the marketplace, it edits it. It does not reject sea or city or road. It provides a comma, so breath can happen and sense can be made. And when morning breathes its first pale instruction over tiled roofs and vines, the brothers set out bowls again, as if to say that beginnings are not hard if one keeps them small and faithful. A pilgrim tightens a strap, a drover checks a hoof, a scholar folds his notebook with the tenderness one reserves for fragile things that have nevertheless survived. Beyond the walls, trade routes knit their patient threads, eastward to old stories written in salt and silk, southward to coasts where boats arrange their prayers and rigging, northward to markets that speak several kinds of weather. Somewhere on those waters, a city of bridges rehearses its own evening, lanterns combing the hair of canals, merchants testing the weight of coins against the weight of rumour, and there, beneath stone ribs and over green water, small rooms will bloom beside a market of voices, the Beccari of Rialto, where wine will stand not as liturgy, but as conversation, and plates will arrive like quick thoughts, and the night will change its accent while keeping the same gentle intention to hold the traveller until his burdens remember how to become lighter. At part 7, we find a narrow doorway along the Rialto where a small room opens like a palm, a Baccaro before the word has quite learned itself, and the canal outside keeps time in green. Inside, the light is the colour of olive pits and brass. It settles on the counter the way dusk settles on water, without hurry, with a whisper of salt. A cask stands, shouldered, against a whitewashed wall. Oak staves, holding the memory of vineyards that lean into Venetian weather from inland hills. Beside it a jar of anchovies, braids silver with oil. A plate of olives waits like patient punctuation. This is a room that believes in the eloquence of small things. A slab of bread with its bark dark crust. A wedge of young cheese whose rind still speaks the dialect of grass. A spoonful of onions sweetened to kindness. A skewer where sardines, pine nuts and breadcrumbs rehearse their modest chorus, what later centuries will call cicchetti. Here, simply, the right-sized answer to an appetite that is working. The host moves with the thorough courtesy of an accountant who knows that every gesture must add up at day's end. He turns the spigot with the quiet accuracy of a pilot trimming sail, and the wine falls into earthen cups in a low stream that sounds a bit like the lagoon thinking to itself. Conversations stack in gentle layers. Greek merchants murmuring of mastic and saffron, a Dalmatian skipper quoting the price of salt as if it were weather, a Jewish money changer naming the hours when gold behaves and when it mischiefs, 2 women from Burano arguing cheerfully about the proper patience for a ragout, their hands confirming points that words can only orbit. From the market next door, voices arrive wearing the perfume of commerce, feathers, spices, cloth the colour of promised festivals, yet the room keeps its own rhythm, unembarrassed by greatness outside, content to be useful warmth, measured in cups and crumbs. The Rialto is a hinge on which half the world opens and closes, and this little bar reads the hinge like scripture. There is a rule here that no one wrote. You do not bring in the wind of big talk until you have allowed your mouth to learn humility from bread. You do not let anger cross the threshold without asking the vinegar to carry some of it for you. A gondolier with shoulders shaped by long, eloquent hours leans his oar against the doorframe and drinks as if cupping a friend's face. A scribe from the Fondaco takes notes with his memory, counting boats by the weight of their wake. A pilgrim, whose debt to the sea is recent and not entirely friendly, swallows gently, discovering that warmth can be taught without lectures. On the shelf, cups wait rim to rim like coins. On the wall, a small icon remembers that here, prayer and trade are not enemies, merely colleagues who prefer different shifts. The air is salted by nearby bridges, by vats of fish laid open, like arguments already decided by the sweet brews of bruised basil, by the clean arithmetic of wine. Stools remember the grammar of backs, a narrow table gleams with the ordinary splendour of oil rubbed into wood by generations of sleeves. When the door opens to the market, light from the canal walks in on the warder's shoulders and glances against the bottles. You can watch the room take a breath without changing its mind. There are courtesies. The freshest cup goes to the most tired face. Loudness must pay its own tariff in extra rounds. A traveller is taught the price of things with a fairness that is both policy and affection. Disputes are postponed until the bridge can listen. If a child comes in with a gleam of hunger, the host pretends a mistake. A slice too thick, a cup poured past prudent, so that gratitude need not bow too low. A priest stands at the threshold for 3 heartbeats, tasting the air like a beekeeper. He nods, enters, accepts a little plate as confession's cousin. Grace said softly becomes the room's second language for a minute. Across the counter, maps spread without paper, a finger tracing the bottleneck at the Hellespont, a thumb placing Genoa just so, knuckles measuring the day's wind in the basin, a palm turning toward the Alps, as if toward an old friend who pretends to be a stranger. Venice is a city that floats on agreements, and the Baccaro is one of the places where those agreements become edible, the civilizing of appetite turning trade from struggle into choreography. A singer tries a line of something Eastern, a minor mode that reminds the room that empires are not only armies but scales and spices. A Roman answers with a comic couplet, and the two musics decide they are cousins. The host sets down a bowl of stewed cuttlefish disguised in their own ink, and a silence approves. Outside the bridge grows footsteps the way a tree grows shade. A cormorant performs patient arithmetic along a mooring pole. Barges arrive stamped with distant weather. The Baccaro keeps its curriculum simple, that hunger can be persuaded rather than defeated. That bitterness, for instance, in radicchio or in life, likes to be introduced to sweetness and to fat. That neighbours can be taught by salt to behave like relatives. That wine should make talk truthful but not unkind. A widow counts change twice and regards the coins as if listening for echoes of the men who carried them here. A spice seller opens his palm to show a pinch of something red as noon, and everyone leans forward, learning with their noses. When the market shutters and the canal's face grows darker, the room doesn't end, it deepens. Lamps build small lakes on the counter where moths hesitantly sail. A tray of fried things releases perfume equivalent to a second bell. The talk loosens but does not fray. Plans are made that will survive until morning because they are held together by the glue of careful appetite. Someone reads aloud a figure from the customs table and then eats an anchovy with such attention that numbers feel briefly forgiven. The door opens again and brings in the chill scent of stone and water, and a rumour that the Levant will be kind this season. The rumour is tasted, not swallowed, and set aside for reconsideration with tomorrow's bread. Later, when cups sit dry in orderly rows, and the cask's shadow grows as solemn as a judge made of wood, the host wipes the counter with a motion that edits the day into something keepable. He banks the lamp. The canal creases itself into sleep. Over the bridge, the market dreams of silk that refuses dust and pepper that moves like warm snow. In the dark, Warehouses, spices turn the air into a shy cathedral. Somewhere to the northwest, where canals become streets and the sea is replaced by patient rivers, a different lesson is being prepared in malt and guild rules. Bruges, where the scent of gruy clings to sleeves and brewers draft their own small treaties, with bitterness, waiting with benches and a heavy spoon for the next traveller who has learned in Venice how a small cup can be large enough for a night. Part 8 in Bruges, the evening smells faintly of herbs that once pretended to be weather. Yarrow, bog myrtle, rosemary, Groot clinging to sleeves the way the day clings to men who have persuaded it into wages. The Guildhall breathes a heavy, good-natured breath. Its doors are old enough to have acquired patience, its lintel worn by hats that touched it out of habit more than reverence. Inside, a long room keeps its benches in straight, honest rows. Tables show the gloss of elbows and the tidy scars of knives that learn to behave. Lamps hang with the self-possession of tradesmen. Their light is practical, gold as soup. The brewer's tokens, mallets, mashes, a barley sheaf painted with affection, look down like kindly foremen. In the corner, a girl turns a paddle in a vat set near the heat, not to brew, but to teach. Steam carries a grammar of bitterness softened by herb and thyme. The air tastes like the inside of an old song, a little sweet, a little medicinal, reassuring as a proverb that has survived generations of argument. Earthen jugs stand ranked like a quiet militia. When the tapster draws, the room pauses to watch the head form, a lace that says the day will, after all, end decently. Men from the cloth halls arrive in the plural. Dyers with blue still persuasive in their cuticles, fullers whose hands look laundered by rivers, weavers who count in patterns even while drinking. They sit shoulder to shoulder as if the benches themselves were looms, and talk with a shuttle that crosses back and forth until fabric happens. The ale is dark, a tempered bitterness that remembers hedge and fen. It moves in the mouth like a careful sermon, saying enough, refusing excess. A wedge of cheese, the colour of stabled straw, arrives with bread whose crust breaks like the first laugh in a stern meeting. There are onions softened in pan fat until they forgive their own sharpness. There is a sausage that acts like punctuation, persuading sentences to end in good order. The guild steward walks his route with a ledger tucked under his arm, as if mercy required documentation. He glances at a cup and knows whether a man needs a second or a slower first. Brewer's rules hang at eye height, not to accuse, but to remind. No adulterations, no measures that flatter themselves, heat steady, payments honest, quarrels to be cooled by counting to 50 or by visiting the yard and measuring the sky for calm. Bruges is a hinged city too, though it opens on mouths of rivers rather than on green water like Venice. Down the street, narrow canals rehearse the moon. Beyond the walls, roads carry wool and argument to and from the north. A Hanse merchant sits among locals like a cousin with a different shoulder. He talks of warehouses that keep their own winters in Lübeck and of how salt must be minded like a proud animal. A scribe at the next table copies none of it, because here facts are shared aloud and memory is considered a trustworthy clerk. Somewhere, a bell for vespers is late or early by a minute. No one corrects it because the beer is teaching a softer version of time measured in sips and listening. A brewer's apprentice, a boy with steam in his hair and confidence still learning to arrange itself, describes today's mash with the solemn joy of a new father. The gruet was balanced, he says, and the older men nod, remembering the years when hops will arrive like a reformer with arguments tall as scaffolds. But for now, in this century of herbs, bitterness is a local matter. grown in ditches and gathered by hands that know the difference between pungent and cruel. The room keeps a quiet pride in that. Flavour as a civic project, taste as a neighbourhood spoken aloud. A widow sells salted eels wrapped in paper. They gleam like commas, inviting pauses. She's allowed to set her basket near the stove because grief does not keep the body warm, and guild rules, for all their exactness, have learnt how to bend at the right joints. Voices here are sturdy. They do not ornament, they build. A fuller tells of a day when rain took the dye and made a miracle of a mistake. Cloth that looked accidentally like dawn and sold for twice the usual because customers like to believe in errors that turn kindly. A man who has never left Flanders names ports he will never see with a tenderness that makes mockery ashamed. Danzig, Riga, Bergen, even their syllables seem to bring a salt breath to the room. The beer helps. It lowers the shoulders and lengthens the sentences. It invites the honest boast and forgives the unnecessary one. Jokes travel down the table like a loaf. They are not cut into equal slices, but no one leaves hungry. At the far end, two aldermen drink with the caution of men who know that tomorrow will require signatures. They smile at nothing for the pleasure of practicing. Rules continue, as kind as they can be. The youngest pours for the eldest first. The brewer whose batch soured last month is not shamed tonight, because a mistake that has already been named needs no more public schooling. Songs may be sung, but only in keys that do not force the shy to leave. When the door opens and a slice of damp air walks in, wearing the smell of canal and horse, the room makes space for it. A place is found by the hearth, a seat dried with a sleeve. Steam bands the rafters. A moth practices being brave around a flame and is gently waved away by a man who has known too many small earnest things come to harm. Later, with appetites properly negotiated, the talk turns to numbers said softly. Grain yields, the price of peat, how many days until the cloth fair. A child is brought in from the cold with a lost glove. The glove is found under a bench where loneliness sometimes takes shelter. A cup of thin ale is offered, as if cups could teach hands to be steadier. The steward at last opens his ledger and writes nothing but a single neat line to square the day, because everything else has already been reconciled in the warmth of benches and the patient arithmetic of shared bitterness turned sociable. Outside, the street composes its own beer of smells. Damp wall, distant soap from a dyer's vat, horse breath weighing the dark. A cart goes by with a sound like a sigh made of wood. Somewhere a door closes with the confidence of hinges that have been oiled by men who do not think kindness beneath their station. When the jugs grow light and the lamps remark to one another that they have been useful, the room begins to put itself away. Benches ease back under tables as if returning to first principles. Crumbs are collected as though they might be sent to a monastery to be taught chastity. The girl at the paddle scrubs the vat with a determination that looks like prayer if you stand at the right angle. The apprentice banks the hearth, coaxing from it a final teachable glow. Men step out into Bruges night, their breath discovering its own alchemy, vapour made visible, proof that warmth has been granted and must now be carried. The canal lies quiet, as if listening for a verdict. The moon offers none, and far to the northeast, where the Baltic smells of iron and long journeys, a red brick city with a salt-bitter mouth is already laying knives and bread on heavy tables, preparing a darker, ship-stout drink for throats salted by weather. Lübeck waiting with herring and rye, and the sound of rigging remembered even indoors. Another chapter in the patient education of night. Part 9. We come to a Hanseatic sailor's tavern in Lübeck, where the Baltic keeps its voice in the rafters, and salt has a seat at every table. The door opens on a breath that belongs to the sea, herring and tar, rope and wet wool, the iron scent of weather that has had opinions all day, and is finally willing to sit down. Red brick holds the room with the patience of warehouses. Beams blackened by smoke and time make a ceiling that remembers masts. A kettle, the size of a promise, hums over the fire. Its steam carries barley and onion into a warmth that knows how to mend a man without remarking on his brokenness. At the counter, a row of earthen jugs waits like disciplined crew. The tapster draws a dark, steady beer, ship stout, long-keeping, a drink brewed to travel, tilting the mug, so the foam sits like a small, obedient cloud. Rye bread arrives coarse and loyal, its crust singing a little as it breaks. Butter keeps a cold, thoughtful face until it learns the firelight. Pickled herring flashes a silver consonant on a plate of quiet crockery. The first mouthful does what good harbours do. It translates distance into nearness so gently that the body's doubts forget their vocabulary. Lübeck's speech is measured in tonnage and tides. Even jokes here keep one eye on the ledger. At a long table, men from Reval, Danzig, and Riga sit with Lübeckers like cousins who disagree only about whose winter is the strictest. They trade prices, wax, timber, furs, in a tone that suggests they are discussing weather's elder sibling. Every figure is accompanied by a story shaped by wind. A pilot knots a bit of cord to show a shoal that behaves like a mood. A cooper traces a circle on the table and names it a cask, then tells how a ship learned patience by riding inside that circle's promise for a cruel week. The room listens with the mercy of the practical. No applause, only the shared understanding that survival is a craft executed in small, repeatable motions. Oil the block, check the seam, lash the lid, respect the caution in a gull's silence. Near the hearth, a boy picks loose tar from a line and rubs it into his hands as if learning a sacrament. His eyes count when his ears rest. A woman from the fish market, apron salted, hair pinned like a map, sets out plates with the firmness of a tide table. Every dish is placed where it belongs, as if misplacing supper might misplace a ship. There are rules here that feel like courtesy rather than law. A man who has spoken more with wind than with people is allowed to be quiet until warmth teaches his voice its floor notes again. The wettest coat gets the peg nearest the door so the room can cure it without grievance. Quarrels pay for their own pints and for the listening that follows. If a stranger sits alone, a bench moves of its own accord. If a story grows too tall, a hand briefly covers a candle, and the shadow shrinks it to honest size. The tavern is a school that denies it is one, its curriculum taught by ladle and rope, stew and chart, the grammar of the Baltic laid out in bowls and knots. From the quay beyond the windows comes the slow baritone of rigging, a reassurance that wood and line acknowledge one another even in the dark. The sound loosens shoulders and lengthens sentences. A singer tries a sea psalm in a minor key and lets it drift into humming because this room prefers choruses that work like nets, wide, strong, which gather without bruising. A customs clerk drinks cautiously from a thick cup, each sip an erasure of columns already added twice. He says little, but his quiet carries the weight of correct sums, which is one of the gentlest kinds of companionship. Beside him, a carpenter who keeps ships honest by cutting away rot explains with his hands how you listen to a plank: press, pause, forgive, replace. Opposite, an old helmsman maps the Skagerrak with scars and laughter. When he lifts his sleeve and shows a thin white seam on his wrist, the room nods as if a saint's relic has been displayed. veneration for work rather than for miracle. In the corner, a cat stands with its paws on a stool and regards a plate of herring with the solemnity due to civic matters. It is rewarded with a small ceremonial portion, because creaturely needs are also part of good governance. The beer holds the room together as a kind of edible treaty. It tastes of grain that agreed to winter. It carries a rumour of smoke, not yet the full sermon one hears farther south, only a hint, as if malt had learned fire's alphabet and chose a few gentle letters. A second round arrives, and the talk deepens without rising. The north learns to say yes in longer vowels. A storm is retold with accuracy earned by humility. No heroics, just a bad angle and a kindness done by a stranger's rope. A widow describes a herring run that was late and then abundant, proof that sometimes the sea pays interest on patience. A young man who has never yet rounded Bornholm asks a question with his shoulders. 3 older men answer in the same language, shifting posture to demonstrate how to lean with a squall. The room approves of knowledge that can be learned by imitating a spine. Later, when the great kettle has turned from instruction to memory and the last plates whisper their porcelain sighs, the tavern performs its closing liturgy. Mugs are inverted to dry like bells at rest. Crumbs are coaxed into a palm and carried to the door for birds who will hold the dawn's first meeting on the roof ridge. The hearth is banked in a neat crescent, a small moon assigned to keep watch. Outside, the Travi breathes darkly toward the sea. Inside, boots release their owners with audible gratitude. Wool learns again the outline of shoulders it has known for years. Plans are chalked on a beam. Rostock if ice consents. Visby when trade remembers itself. Bergen when daylight grows less stingy and the chalk is smudged with a thumb, the way a promise is made human and therefore possible. Sleep here comes as a harbour pilot, gentle hand on the tiller, guiding the mind past submerged worries toward depth with fewer arguments. In bunks above the room or in lodgings up the lane, men lie down with the comfort that timber is keeping its side of the bargain, dry, sound, seasoned. Women dream of prices that will not embarrass them at the stall. A boy dreams of a compass that does not scold him when he is afraid. The tavern's last sound is the small applause of embers rearranging their logic. The last scent is rye agreeing with butter that the night has earned its humility. And when morning will come, in its grey woolen way, ships will untie their sentences and continue the paragraph of trade, the Baltic reciting its stern lullaby. Southward, beyond marshes and along patient rivers, another lesson will be waiting where the Regnitz runs, rooms in Bamberg where malt meets smoke without apology, where beer remembers the hearth's flavour, and where tables will become bright islands set in a tide of fragrant air, inviting even old weather to sit down and be kind. Part 10. In Bamberg, the Regnitz moves like polished pewter under a winter sky, and the tavern beside it has learned to breathe smoke as if it were a second kind of weather, a warmth you can drink and carry home in your coat. The door gives way to a breath of malt that has sat with fire and become a story. It is not the acrid shout of a chimney, but the patient grammar of beechwood turned into memory. Sweet first, then a small calm bitterness, then something like bread remembering harvest. Beams run dark as river pilings. The floor holds the steady gloss left by boots that have come in out of frost with arguments to settle and have allowed themselves to be distracted by supper instead. Along one wall, a tiled stove keeps counsel with itself, issuing a radiant decree that all spines shall uncurl. On the other, casks squat like brown constellations, each bung an orderly star. The tapster's hands know their catechism: rinse, tilt, draw, lift, foam shaped to a modest crown, the glass left with just enough head to make a first swallow feel like a small ceremony rather than a thirst's interruption. The beer arrives the way certain voices do. Smoked, yes, but not theatrical. More hearth than campfire, more oven than accident. It carries a rumour of bacon without the salt, of hazelnut without the sweetness, and the mouth, surprised, learns quickly that comfort can be complex and still keep its manners. Plates follow with the diplomacy of plenty. Sausages punctuate the evening, plump commas persuading talk to continue at a measured pace. Onions have been made tender until their former sharpness reads like character rather than complaint. A portion of sauerkraut keeps the fat honest and the tongue awake. Rye bread arrives with a crust that cracks like a good joke. Dry first, then generous. At the long table, men from the hill breweries compare choices. Some smoke their own malt over beech, others bargain for it. One swears by a darker kilning that keeps the sweetness close to the floor of the flavour. Another prefers a gentle amber that lets the wood walk in late and leave early. None of them speak like salesmen. They speak like men in a city that has built stone upon stone since imperial days and knows that continuity is an art as well as an engineering. Across from them, a cooper traces circles on the table with a fingertip, as if reminding his hands that the day is allowed to be round. He nods at each sip, a blessing given back to the cask that taught him patience. Near the stove, a midwife eats in a purposeful hush. Now and then she smiles at no one, carrying in her head a tally of safe births kept like a rosary whose beads are names. A pair of students argue, then agree about whether smoke is a taste or a place. They conclude that it is a bridge, and the room adopts the verdict as if it had always known it. Bamberg keeps rules the way river towns do, light but legible. Wet coats to the peg nearest the door. A man who has been quiet all day is not paid for with silence. Someone asks him about his boots, and he answers with steps that become words. The last slice of bread is for the one who wiped most plates clean because labour recognises itself. The beer shows another rule. Second glasses should taste like the first, but friendlier. They do. The tongue learns a route through smoke to grain and back, a small pilgrimage without blisters. Outside, the Regnitz rehearses its low consonants against the banks. Inside, chairs answer with domesticated echoes, a wooden dialect of river talk. On the far side of the room, an old man lifts his glass toward the stove in a gesture that is not quite a toast and not quite prayer, and the fire answers with a settling sound that might be approval. Stories here are trimmed to fit the evening. A maltster mentions a barn roof repaired in time. A bargeman tells of ice that politely refused to form the night a child was expected. A widow repeats the price of fuel, and the room set breathes around the number until it looks less like a cliff and more like a hill that can be climbed by carrying smaller loads more often. A traveller from Franconian vineyards offers a detail about pruning, the way a vine taught to suffer just enough will crowd its sweetness inward. Several heads nod, as if the same were true of people who have met a measured winter. In the corner, a fiddler warms his hands and tries a tune that smells faintly of linden blossom and book pages. He plays quietly because the stove has the lead tonight, and music has learned to be companion rather than protagonist when supper is doing its work. Later, when cheeks carry the soft bloom that beer gives without insisting, the talk leans briefly toward the past. Someone remembers a year when smoke was all anyone had of fire. Someone else, gentler, remembers a harvest so generous even the river seemed to drink more slowly out of consideration. The room agrees that taste is a kind of archive, and that this beer, by keeping a fire's history in the grain, lets the tongue consult old minutes without getting lost in nostalgia's attic. The tapster, hearing the conversation approach philosophy, wisely sets down a plate of apple cake like a period at the end of a sentence that has earned it. Forks make a small polite weather over porcelain. Candles throw halos on tankards. The stove issues one last paragraph of heat and then reclines into watchfulness. Closing here is not an eviction but a benediction distributed in small acts. Glasses are rinsed and upended like bells resting face down. Crumbs are gathered for morning birds. The iron latch finds its night position with the assurance of a habit that has kept families and stories indoors for centuries of damp. Breath lifts in the doorway as guests step back into the cold. On the river, the dark is orderly, a ledger balanced with moonlight. In bed chambers above the tavern, dreams carry a light smoke that does not smother. Only the memory of warmth arranged into an aroma the mind can keep without occupying the hands. The city sleeps with its towers trimmed neat against the sky, a tidy silhouette that keeps a priestly watch over roofs, cellars, and the day's little mercies banked like coals for morning. When dawn will smudge the frost and bells begin their cordial arithmetic, men will turn malt, women will slice onions, water will consider how best to be helpful, and the casks will remember their geometry. And southward, past vineyards that sip fog and towns that stack their sunlight in cloisters, a different table is being laid where wine leads the conversation and kitchens answer in herbs. Avignon, where papal evenings taught spoons to be dignified and saucers to carry diplomacy, already brightening its copper and summoning a room in which warmth dresses itself as ceremony and the night tastes, for a while, of governance, made gentle. Part 11. In Avignon, the river folds evening into a long silk ribbon, and a papal household's tavern, half kitchen, half antechamber to diplomacy, glows as if copper pans could remember prayers. The door opens to a hierarchy of scents arranged with soft authority. Rosemary first, then thyme, then a mild surrender of garlic blooming in oil. Beneath it, stock that has been learning manners all afternoon. Bones whispering their calcium into something that will steady the hand. And from a sideboard, the round persuasion of Rhone wine breathing, as though sunlight had been decanted and asked to speak in a lower voice. The room bears a simple grandeur, whitewashed arches, a floor of patient stone, a crucifix whose plainness keeps appetite honest. Candles stand in iron like courteous sentinels. Their light edits the faces of clerks and envoys into a single companionable grammar. A steward, sleeves rolled with ceremonial neatness, reads the room the way a choirmaster reads breath. This table is hungry for comfort, that one for argument softened by fat, another for a lesson disguised as supper. Platters arrive in a cadence that refuses haste. Loaves with a stamped seal baked this morning in the palace ovens, crust crackling like polite applause. A ragout of lamb turned tender enough to consider forgiveness its true profession. Vegetables gloss to a sheen that makes their green feel like mercy. The wine is poured with a priestly wrist, not as indulgence but as translation. Even the most stubborn day learns to speak in its accent. At one end, a clerk with dust still on his hem from the archives describes a marginal note that saved a treaty from a contradiction. At the other, a musician travelling with a bishop proves that a melody can carry doctrine more gently than a sermon if the room is willing to be kind. Avignon listens, not with the hungry flattery of courts that must invent at their own appetite, but with the patient appetite of a city that has learned the dignity of feeding the world's errands. A cook sets down a tureen, and it becomes briefly a small theology, steam rising, bowls offered in order of quietest first. A ladle that never forgets the bottom deserves consideration. Salt is pinched with the caution due to power. Pepper is allowed to make its case in well-chosen words. Parsley finishes sentences as if it were punctuation learned from gardens. Rules hold here, but they behave like manners rather than law. The guest from farthest away receives the second pour. To show welcomes is forward-facing. News that can wound waits for the second course when broth has made the heart more resilient. A woman who eats alone is accompanied by conversation that knows how to be present without becoming a demand. Even the knives speak moderate Latin, broad, useful, bright without vanity. In a corner, a ledger lies open as if about to receive absolution. The master of the buttery tallies not only casks and wheels and sacks, but favours settled and tempers cooled. The true inventory of a kitchen that keeps a city from overheating its own importance. Stories travel across the table with the balance of well-made sauce. A messenger recounts riding the Rhone's shoulder at dusk, swallows stitching the air above his hat. A mason from Villeneuve explains an arch with his hands, and then eats as if to set his ego back into its stone. A nun on an errand for her house in the countryside names herbs as though calling the roll of small saints. Sage, savoury, marjoram, each granted its vocation in the evening's work. The papal guardsman off-duty drinks watered wine and learns to rest his jaw. He laughs at something too modest to repeat and looks younger by a year. At the doorway, a child peeks with that bold shyness children own. The steward conspires with a spoon and a smile, and an extra slice of bread finds a mission. From the back, the scullery sends up a steady, modest music, water accepting plates back into the world, steel chiming against clay, the liturgy of necessary things done without witness. It is astonishing how quickly dignity grows when chores are executed with love. The wine shows its range as the room moves through its temperaments. First, red that carries cherries like a careful lantern. Then a deeper bottle with an old cellars, cool in its grammar. Finally, a simple table blend that reminds every mouth it is permitted to be ordinary and still beautiful. Outside bells perform their civil calculus, portioning the night into merciful sums. Inside talk turns a degree more human. A scribe admits he misspelled a baron's name and was forgiven. A physician observes kindly that broth is the mother of peace. A pilgrim, surprised to be here among brocade and files, explains that dust knows no rank. The room accepts each sentence and seasons it lightly. At the far trestle, a singer lifts a small psalm until it is only breath-shaped into gratitude. The tune wanders the rafters and finds a home there, a migrant welcomed without paperwork. When platters of stewed white beans arrive with curls of orange zest, some remember famines and sit straighter, others remember feasts and soften. Perhaps this is governance at its best. Hunger taught to speak, plenty taught to listen, and a reasonable wine officiating between them. Later, when copper has returned to its wall and the last plates are stacked like a well-argued document, the steward makes the closing rounds that turn a meal into memory. A cloth wipes away anxieties alongside crumbs. The embers are spread so their red can keep watch. A pitcher of water is set where a thirsty soul may find it without ceremony. Clerks retie their satchels. Boots accept a little polish from a rag that knows it was once linen of higher ambition. Good nights are spoken in soft plurals. The river's breath wanders in through narrow windows. Whetstone, leaf, a rumour of boats turning slowly in their sleep, and the room thanks it with a bow of cool air. Sleep will find the city thinking in pleasant fractions. A third of the night for mercy, a third for digestion, a third for dreams that write letters no courier will ever deliver. In rooms above, a violinist hums 2 notes to remember them tomorrow. Somewhere across the square, a cat adjudicates the moonlit passage of mice with judicial restraint. The kitchen has already begun, morning in its mind, bones set to soak, bread preferments murmuring in their bowls, wine marked for the next audience between appetite and policy. And far off, where river trade becomes road and cool cellars, keep their promises to grain, another room is readying a different creed. Prague, with malt bright as new coin, and lager learning its early scriptures in stone vaults, preparing to teach that patience can be made liquid and poured, a lesson as old as thirst and as new as the next clean glass. Part 12. In Prague the evening gathers under stone like honey in a cool jar, and in a malthouse tavern off the old town square, patience is taught in glasses that lift their own quiet light. He comes in from streets that have been thinking in alleys and arches all day, where bells debate gently with the clock, and the river keeps a metal hush beneath its bridges. Inside, vaults of pale stone curve overhead with the calm of wrists cupped to shelter a flame. A tiled stove hums its domestic sermon. Benches carry the softened shine of long conversations that learned to end without winners. At the back, a low door admits a disciplined draught from cellars that remember winter even in June. From there, casks wait like polite boulders, their hoops the colour of old coins. Across a scrubbed counter, the tapster performs a modest liturgy. Rinse, slant, draw, letting the stream meet glass along the side, so the foam builds a careful cap, white as breadcrumb light, sealing the freshness as if it were a letter addressed to the tongue. What arrives is lucid, a young lager still learning to say yes in this accent, malt bright as clean straw, a bitterness that behaves more like grammar than like argument, and a finish that asks nothing more than that the day exhale. The first sip is a window opened, the second is a small reconciliation, the third explains that patience is not a posture, but a flavour learned in cold stone rooms, where yeast is allowed to finish its sentence and sleep before anyone asks it to sing again. Plates come that prefer nouns to adjectives. Pork whose brownness is sincerity rather than brag, dumplings cut into tender moons, cabbage stewed until its memory of earth becomes friendliness. Mustard places its sharp hand on the shoulder of fat and persuades it to speak more softly. Knives are honest and round-tipped. Spoons do the heavier theology. At one end of the trestle, a maltster measures the day with his palms, describing the grain sweetness at kiln's edge, the way warmth must be firm but never impatient. At the other, a cooper discusses silence, the good kind, in staves that have learned to keep the brewery secrets while still breathing like living wood. Near the stove, an old woman folds napkins with the gravity of a judge. The cloth remembers lakes in winter, and so do her hands. 2 students attempt to make the world tidier with Latin, and decide instead to drink to its messiness. They do it politely, and the room congratulates them for their restraint by continuing to be kind. A fiddler sets down his case and eats like a man earning the right to play. When the bow finally wakes, the tune walks rather than struts and travels at table height, allowing talk to keep its hat on. There are rules here dressed as courtesies. The man with the longest day receives the shortest wait. A traveller's coat is turned so its pockets face the wall, a gesture that protects dignity as surely as it thwarts thieves. Orders are taken in a rotation old as knitting. A child who arrives embarrassed by hunger is given a smaller glass of something amber and harmless, because children should learn to belong to rooms that behave. Disagreements are placed under the table like wet umbrellas. They are claimed again at closing if they still seem necessary. Between rounds, the tapster keeps his wrist quiet and his eyes bright. He can tell from the angle of a glass how a heart is doing and pours accordingly. Above the counter, a chalk hand writes figures that seem to balance themselves. Below, the drip tray collects a silver arithmetic that will be used to rinse tomorrow's first joy. Prague loves arguments finished by architecture, bridges that explain themselves even to tired feet, spires that correct the evening sky without announcing the correction. The tavern copies the lesson in food that is tidy, beer that is lucid, talk that chooses the least dramatic verb. A clerk from the old town hall admits, smiling at his own solemnity, that a column misled him, and he apologized to it as if it were a person. The room nods because everyone has apologized to stone in this city, and stone has been generous in its pardons. A printer with ink-trimmed fingers asserts that lager is a book bound in cold. The maltster counters that it is a window. A woman who has served soup longer than both of them have had opinions says it is a bench and wins. In the corner, a map of Bohemia hangs with the calm of settled weather. Someone raises a glass to the idea that rivers are patient teachers and that the Vltava is among the best. The beer's second voice is softer, deeper, a pale gold with a shy bitterness, shakes hands with bread and cabbage, and leaves the mouth tidier than it found it. Outside, hoof and heel write their hieroglyphs on worn stone. Inside, chairs answer with gentler consonants. The stove exhales a last grateful paragraph. A moth inspects the lamp and is rescued with the deftness learned by those who have watched many small earnest things fail to recognize danger. Someone tells of a winter when casks racked like sleeping soldiers kept their heads while the street lost its courage. Someone else of a summer when the beer seemed to taste of straw hats and laundry lines. Both are believed because the glass in hand contains the evidence. The tapster leans an ear to a cask and hears nothing, which is the right sound. He smiles the way surgeons must smile when a wound has decided to heal. Later, when the second jug has been persuaded to confess and the tally has become a friendly rumour, the room rests on its elbows. Faces adopt that bloom which suggests nothing will be improved by another sentence. A man unfolds a pocket watch that once belonged to a grandmother who lacquered it with stories. He winds it 2 careful clicks and closes it again, reassured that time is willing to continue. In a small pause, the fiddler finds a line that sounds like frost melting on stone. He lets it fall back into silence rather than finish it, because not finishing is a craft too. The tapster places water on the table without being asked. The old woman counts napkins in pairs, then ties them in a bundle with a piece of string that used to bind good news. And far underfoot, the cellars keep their republican calm. The same cold for saints and carpenters, for boasting and for regret, ensuring that tomorrow's first pour will be as clear as the hope that names it. Closing is a settled choreography. Glasses inverted like small bells whose ringing is deferred. Crumbs brushed toward a palm that has learned not to waste. Benches eased back under the table as if returning to their scabbards. The latch finds its night voice. Outside, the square rehearses sleep, statues pretending to be stricter than they feel. The river carries away today's overheard sentences and brings back a handful of stars in exchange. He steps into the street with the taste of patience in his mouth and feels the city answer with cobbles that have agreed for centuries to hold the feet of those who try to walk well. And eastward, where the salt roads begin to tell their crystalline stories and warehouses smell like a modest ocean hidden in stone, another room is being set for travellers and traders, a crack-off table laid with rye and cured meat and a beer the colour of straw at dusk, waiting to turn commerce into supper, and supper into the kind of memory that keeps a cold morning honest. Part 13. In Krakow the evening gathers, like a shawl around the market square, and down a side street near the road to the Wieliczka pits, a salt merchant's tavern holds a measured warmth that tastes of rye and patient winters. He steps through a door trimmed by many shoulders and finds a room that has learned the decency of stone, walls whitewashed into calm, beams dark as bread crust, tables smoothed by elbows that have bargained all day and now wish only to rest. The air keeps a quiet museum of scents, smoked beef, cabbage, stewed until its sternness becomes counsel, the mineral whisper of brine on woolen coats, and beneath it all a small sweetness from the oven where loaves complete the modest miracle. They began at dawn. A copper pot lifts its lid just enough to offer a promise of barley soup. A pan sighs as onions make peace with fat. A jug of pale beer waits in the shade, where cellars teach thirst to be civilized. When cups arrive, they are sturdy and clear, holding a straw gold that does not brag. The first sip is countryside translated into light. The second persuades travel-weary muscles to unclench. The third discovers a note like hay after rain and decides not to name it aloud for fear of breaking the spell. At the long table, a merchant traces roads on the wood with a fingertip. Sandomierz and Lwów, the amber way north, the guild routes west toward the cloth cities. Each line a ledger that has been taught to smile. A carter with salt-dusted boots eats without hurry, the day's miles folded into the bread. Ooh. Opposite him, a scribe from the salt office cleans his pen with a tired elegance, and drinks as if he were erasing small injustices, one swallow at a time. Near the hearth, a woman with sleeves rolled to the elbow salts meat from a wooden bowl. Her hand moves with the confident thrift of those who have known a hard year and refuse to let it teach meanness. A pair of students, faces lit by intentions larger than their purses, argue softly about whether trade shapes virtue or only reveals it. The tavern, which has watched coins turn into supper since before either boy was born, permits the question to remain handsomely undecided. Rules here are domestic and kind. The dampest cloak takes the peg closest to the door, so the room may cure it by degrees. A man who arrives alone leaves less so. Benches are elastic, conversation available, but never compulsory. Quarrels must buy bread for all involved before they may proceed. Most discover they cannot quite afford to be angry. When a traveller counts coins twice, the host pretends not to see, and the ladle remembers generosity better than mathematics. The salt, a power that can ruin or rescue, is pinched with priestly caution. Fingers touch their brows by habit after they season a dish, as if blessing the boundary between enough and too much. Above the counter, a small scale rests with its tongue out in play. It has weighed more than commerce, patience, fairness, a town's refusal to let weather become policy. Stories settle like additional chairs. A miner's wife tells of the luminous tunnels, cathedrals carved from the earth's tears, where saints and chandeliers are born from patience and pick strokes. Her voice makes the walls seem to glimmer. A teamster describes a winter when wheels were iron excuses and sled runners wrote better poems than hooves. Bandits considered the road and reconsidered after soup and a lecture from the moon. An old man with a beard as disciplined as a ledger nods in time to no one's music, making a beat for the room to relax by. He remembers a salt harvest when the brine tanks turned stubborn and the whole town learned the theology of stirring, steady, steady, not because haste is wicked, but because haste forgets outcomes. Plates arrive with provincial honesty, thick slices of cured beef that ask mustard to translate their strength into sentences, dumplings that make a case for gravity as a virtue, cucumbers sour enough to keep desire attentive, a saucer of horseradish that behaves like a stern aunt, bracing, corrective, followed by affection. The pale beer keeps repeating its soft grammar. Grain first, then a crispness like clean linen, then the shy echo of flowers that have worked for a living. It approves of meat, forgives cabbage, and tells rye bread that its serious face is handsome. Conversation learns to breathe between bites. Laughter takes the temperature of the room and rises only as high as the beams allow. Somewhere a fiddle tests a note and sits back down. The night is already music enough. Spoon against bowl, chair leg confiding in the floor. The rasp of salt across a board, like tiny stars, being spread where they can be most useful. Outside, hooves re-syllable the cobbles. The square rehearses moonlight on trumpeted hours. Smoke writes its unreadable cursive on the sky. Inside, a boy counts sacks in his head and counts blessings with his thumb on the table's edge. He asks where the caravans go when the map runs out of nouns. Nowhere, says a carter, smiling. And then they come back and call it somewhere. The boy nods as if this were geography rather than philosophy, which in this room it is. A widow counts change and finds she has enough for an extra crust. She buys it, as one might buy insurance against loneliness. The host passes behind her and leaves a wedge of cheese with the practiced clumsiness of kindness that hopes not to be noticed. Later, when steam has settled into woolen cups, have learned the slope of their emptiness, the tavern practices its closing liturgy. Crumbs are herded into a palm and carried to the door for birds that will make dawn official. Knives are wiped with a cloth that remembers aprons and lullabies. The fire is tucked with a poker that behaves like an old uncle. The scribe writes a neat line in a small book, date, weather, shipments promised, and looks relieved to have captured the day without handcuffs. The merchant pockets a list and tells it not to fret. Roads like to be surprised by generosity. Above, in loft rooms where sacks breathe in their sleep, dreams walk carefully around piles of brightness mined from darkness, and the house keeps its balance, the way honest scales do, by resisting both flattery and despair. Stepping out, he finds the night considerate, frost the size of a whisper on the window, a gust that chooses not to argue. Somewhere east, the salt tunnels continue their patient hymn under villages that never hear it. Somewhere west, cloth cities rehearse their looms and their proud quarrels. The road bends toward low countries where wool invents markets and voices learn to haggle without losing their dignity. Ghent, under its tall halls and river lights, readying a table where weavers eat like men who have taught threads to march in order, and where a tavern will greet them with a menu strong enough to keep labour from turning cruel. Part 14. In Ghent, the cloth halls lift their ribs against the sky like ships built to sail on air, and along a canal that keeps the city's pulse in a silver line, a weaver's tavern sets out its evening as if laying warp for a loom that will make warmth instead of cloth. He steps inside, and the room answers with the blunt, good smell of labour being rewarded. Stew dense, with beef and onions, coaxed towards sweetness, loaves, whose crusts crack as though concluding an argument in the bread's favour. A wedge of cheese, the colour of straw kept dry through a wet season, A pot of beans finished with a little vinegar so the tongue remembers to stay alert. From a barrel slung in its wooden yoke, wine leans toward laughter. From a cask, ale explains itself in fewer words. Earth, grain, a mild bitterness, like clear instructions. Benches run tight to tables polished by sleeves and wages. Pegs hold caps that still remember rain. A stove keeps the kind of heat that turns stubbornness into candour. The guild marks, shears, combs, a stylised shuttle, hang above the wainscot like small saints of prosperity. In this city, the day measures itself in threads counted and knots untangled, arguments with warp settled by a patient shuttle. Here, in the evening's calmer grammar, hands release their tools and learn the weight of cups instead. A dyer arrives with blue under his fingernails, a faint cathedral of indigo lingering in the half-moons. A fuller follows, shoulders remembering the thump and roll of cloth under wooden hammers. A spinner, with wind-burnished cheeks, sets her basket by the hearth and is given a seat without being asked to stand long enough for courtesy to become theatre. They talk shop the way river towns talk weather, precise without vanity. Too much alum, and the cloth sulks, the dyer says, and the room nods. Beat it longer in the stocks, the fuller answers, until the fibres learn to forgive. Sat at the farboard, a factor from the counting houses tallies bolts and deadlines with a pencil that looks nervous in his hand. The tavern forgives him his sums when he pays, for the round before the weavers must pretend not to be thirsty. A boy new to the guild learns to carry 4 trenchers at once and to listen with his eyes. He blinks the way apprentices blink when the world is larger and kinder than warned. Rules hold here, the sort that make fellowship easy without making freedom small. The loudest story buys the quietest person supper. The last heel of bread belongs to the one who patched a neighbour's torn sleeve on market day. A quarrel is allowed but must step outside for 2 breaths and return as a disagreement with manners. The tavern keeps a ledger open to the guild's emergency fund. Embarrassment is refused service while need sits and eats. In the corner, 2 women compare prices with a discretion that could teach diplomacy. Their hands measure imaginary cloth in the air, turning space into fabric, then laughter into currency. A bell hung from a beam is struck once when a widow enters. Conversation lowers itself respectfully by half a tone until she has a seat and something warm in front of her. These small rituals are the city quieting its own noise, the way a loom hushes when the shuttle is between hands. Bowls arrive and are emptied with gratitude practical rather than poetic. Beef yields, carrots, honest and orange as good intentions, keep their shape. A tangle of onions reminds everyone how sweetness is sometimes a long patience. The ale is amber, its head a tidy collar that does not show off. It tastes of fields outside the walls where geese trouble the grass and wind rehearses distant rain. Red wine, Brabant proud and slightly argumentative, insists on making friends with cheese and succeeds. The room's music is made of tools left off duty, knives tapping trenches, spoons making gentle weather in earthenware, the feathered whir of a spindle resumed out of habit, then stopped because supper outranks skill. A fiddler, off shift from the cloth hall where he keeps workers marching through the afternoon, draws a line of tune that does not demand applause. It simply marks time so talk can lie down in its shadow and rest. Stories here are woven with fewer adjectives, more examples. A man tells of a bolt ruined by a careless spark. The room murmurs the little funeral cloth deserves and moves on to the repair. Another remembers a year when the river rose and the looms climbed to the upper rooms like sheep to a hill. Hands grew clever with ladders and cloth survived on rafters while the city discussed humility in wet shoes. News from abroad arrives as rumour with a price tag. A trader speaks of English wool dressed like a peacock and selling itself too dearly. A woman from the market says peacock's molt and smiles into her cup. In a niche, a painted lamb looks over the room with the bland sanctity assigned to guild patrons. Someone has tied a scrap of dyed thread around its wooden ankle, a prayer looped small and bright. The talk turns, as it will, to fairness. How many hands between fleece and cloak? How many mouths in a coin? The factor clears his throat and says the books must balance, or buyers grow pious with excuses. The dyer suggests that books also have margins where mercy can write. No one wins, the stew does. Plates are wiped clean with ends of bread. A jug makes a persuasive case for a second round, but accepts a refusal when tomorrow's early bell is mentioned. Work in this city is not a cruelty, it is a promise. Go to bed and let morning keep its side. A girl at the hearth mends a comb with wire and the patience of daughters. Her mother watches every 10th stitch and then begins to watch every 5th because love distrusts its own indulgence. Later, when the stove sighs and the canal's cool breath underlines the windows, the room eases into its closing ritual. Caps descend from pegs onto heads made lighter by food. Debts are counted low and paid at volume. The host writes a neat line in a book that is part household, part chronicle, names portions, a note that Hans laughed for the first times since his mother's funeral. Benches go back under tables with the obedient scrape of furniture that has joined the Guild of Manners. A lantern is trimmed. The floor is swept with a broom that has learned to be tender with rushes. Outside, the cloth halls keep their dark, like a folded bolt. The river combs the moon into thin strands. Geese consider the ethics of sleep. He steps into the night, and the city wears its labour without complaint. Arches like raised shoulders, bridges smoothed by carts, windows learning to be shy. Far north, where evening grows flatter, and wind adds its stern claws to every sentence, a different table gathers its resolve. Edinburgh's Canongate, with ale that tastes of barley on lean soil, and a fire that keeps its promises to men who work in weather, waiting with a red coal and a heavy spoon to teach the next kindness. Part 15. In Edinburgh's Canongate, the wind comes down the closes like a clerk with urgent papers, and the tavern door, dark with weather and welcome, receives him into a room that knows how to square its shoulders against the north and smile anyway. The hearth is a red geometry, coal banked into a gentle arithmetic of heat, iron hung like punctuation from a black bar where kettles breathe patiently. Light spills across flagstones and climbs the panelling until oak looks almost warm-blooded. Ale waits in casks that have learned the local vowels. Broad, calm, a barley sweetness kept lean by air that rarely flatters. The first pull wears a ring of foam like a modest collar, and the nose finds heather and smoke only as rumour, not decree. Supper is a study in honesty, a shoulder of mutton that has yielded to hours rather than arguments, a pie with the lid brown the colour of thrift, neeps softened to the texture of good advice, and oatcakes that snap like tidy decisions. Boots thaw in a row beside the settle. Wool loosens its frown. The air smells of peat, iron, onion, wet leather, and a friendliness that prefers understatement. Above the ingle nook, a shelf of pewter glows like quiet silver weather. Above that, a map of the Firth remembers ships by memory rather than by ink. The room is proportioned for company rather than spectacle. Low lintels that require grace of tall men, beams that accept the occasional apology from a forehead, benches that insist two strangers become neighbours by the second course. At the longboard, a mason lays out the day's walls with his hands, stone upon stone, a discipline of gravity and patience. Beside him, a weaver from Leith counts in threads even while eating, fingers unconsciously measuring the world into workable widths. A clerk from the Parliament House drinks slowly, the taste making a careful argument to his tongue for moderation as policy. He listens more than he speaks, because words carry weather here and must be set down with the same care as thatch. Near the hearth, a woman mends a sleeve with a needle that gleams like the line between two opinions. Her child watches the thread pass and repass, learning that repair is a kind of magic stronger than newness because it remembers. The tavern keeps rules that behave like good manners. The wettest cloak gets the peg nearest the door. The one who has walked furthest receives the nearest seat to the fire, without having to deserve it. Quarrels must buy bread for the table before they may proceed, and if the wind finds its way under the sill and starts a draught, a boy with hair like a spark will fetch turf to persuade it otherwise. When someone sings, it is the size of the room that chooses the key. A low air rises, shaped by hills and rain, and settles again without demanding to be clapped. Outside, the close squeezes the night into a narrow ribbon of stars. Inside, candles widen it, and the eye forgives the calendar for being stern. Stories here are built with stone verbs and little mortar. A crossing on the Pentlands, when snow taught silence its doctrine, a tide at Leith that refused to be bullied and then relented, a harvest that began sulking and ended proud. The room nods, polishing memory on the sleeve of present warmth. A drover, wind-chafed and economical with adjectives, explains that cattle have their own reasons and that men are improved by learning them. The host replies with an extra ladle because philosophy should never be left hungry. The ale's second voice is kinder than its first, broader in the mouth, the bitterness stepping back a pace as if making room for talk. It tastes like land worked well, and whether argued with fairly. The hearth pops, a red starlet. A clock somewhere, disagreeing with church bells, keeps its own version of truth. The door opens and shuts with the sentence of a latch that has said yes to more winters than it bothers to remember. A traveller from the North Road brings in a kink of frost with him. He's given a chair and a bowl, and a moment to let the chill climb off his bones and sit by itself on the settle like a pet no one will pet. He eats with the soft gallop of a man who has learned to ration eagerness, his shoulders lower. The room adjusts to include him the way hills make room for a loch without noise, with permanent effect. Time here is measured by the waste of a candle and the height of coal. When the pie yields its last good sentence and the mugs are more story than sip, the talk turns to fairness and its cousins, prudence, mercy, thrift. Taxes walk through the room like a weather pattern. Opinions open their umbrellas and then close them again, damp but intact. No one wins. The fire does. The cat, who has read the law of gravity more times than any human present, obtains a corner of the settle by citing precedent and purring. A fiddler tunes 3 notes and chooses to practice silence. In its steady company, hearts arrange themselves more tidily, like papers stacked at last. Closing is a choreography learned by lamp and habit, mugs inverted like bells, crumbs gathered for birds with early appointments, the hearth curbed into a crescent that will keep one red eye open against mischief, the latch finding its night voice, a soft consent. He steps into the close, and the wind, a seasoned clerk, files the day underdone. The castle keeps its watch without boasting. The moon wears a shawl of cloud and pretends to be poorer than she is. Breath climbs the cold like a pilgrim. Stone, satisfied, gives nothing away but the courtesy of not taking more heat than it needs. And far to the southwest, where streets drop to the sea, and the air salts its own sentences, a different door lifts its hinge to sailors and fishers, Lisbon's Alfama, with young wine that winks and charcoal that perfumes the night, already fanning its small flames, and setting out plates that taste of tide and returning. Part 16. In Lisbon's Alfama, the streets fold and unfold like the pleats of a sail, and a harbour tavern at dusk breathes charcoal and salt, as if the Tagus itself had paused to warm its hands before carrying the city out toward the open blue. He steps in from an alley that smells of water kept in clay and finds a room arranged by tide rather than by ruler, tables set at small angles like boats dozing against a quay, lamps suspended on quiet chains, their rings of light drifting lazily across plastered walls the colour of late apricots. The brazier keeps its soft, persuasive sermon. Olive wood hushed into embers, a fan's single wing coaxing flame. On the grate, sardines turned silver to pearl, their skins stippled with citrus and a pinch of courage. Further back, a pan receives garlic and green oil, and the air decides to learn how to sing. Wine arrives in squat, thick-bellied jugs with beaded collars of condensation. Vinho verde, bright as an early promise, a spritz of youth in its step. Poured into clay cups, it lifts and softens the voice in one courtesy. Bread is set down with the practicality of prayer. Olives behave like a chorus of small moons. Wedges of cheese carry pasture and patience. The room makes a harbour out of appetite. Fishermen still leaning at a tilt that all day has negotiated with waves. A shipwright with sawdust in his cuffs and a shrug that remembers cedar. A woman who sells salt by morning and lullabies by evening, her hands confident as oars. At a bench near the door, a boy with rope burns bright on his palms, swallows supper like a lesson he will gladly be examined on at dawn. Alfama's manners are sea manners, brief, direct, generous. The wettest cloak takes the peg nearest the draught, quarrels when they happen, pay for grilled bread rubbed with tomato and thyme before they are allowed another word. A stranger is introduced to the house cat and therefore to the rules. News comes in on shoulders and leaves in cups. A wind that refused to remember its orders south of Setúbal. A merchant's claim of pepper that met the tongue with stars. A reef that believes in religion, but only as far as water is concerned. A sailor pours a thimble from a flask that smells like a boiled orchard and calls it medicine. The host pretends not to see and passes him a plate with the gravity of a priest. The wine is kind to fatigue. It lays a clean sheet over the day's bruises, but not so thickly that tomorrow cannot find them to finish the healing. Somewhere in the corner, a viola practices 3 chords, as if hoping to find the right word for weather. The chords do not hurry, and so the room grows braver in its gentleness. Plates arrive like tidy islands. Sardines surrender in a flicker of light and smoke. Clams steam open, each little mouth confessing a sweet brine that makes bread proud to be useful. A bowl of caldo verde sets potato and cal to a murmuring conversation that ends in agreement. An orange, halved and sugared, is introduced to fire and returns with a new accent. The talk tilts between shore and road. A mason who repairs sea walls explains that stone has to be persuaded to learn the grammar of water. A navigator draws with his finger on the table. Wind rose, currents, a rumour of islands that might be clouds resting. He shrugs and says the map is a prayer with better ink. A woman whose husband rides the river as if it were a patient animal offers the room a proverb: take care of your water jars, and your water will take care of you. And the room nods, because jugs here are citizens too. The cat appropriates a corner of warmth and pretends the world has been correctly arranged by its doing. Rules continue, easy, almost laughing. The first cup of wine is for thirst, the second for listening. The third is kept small and meant for gratitude. A boy fetching plates has permission to stare at the ocean every time he crosses the threshold. He returns each time with a more accurate description of its colour. A widow from the hill hangs her shawl on the back of a chair and is met with a glass before she can sit. She drinks, swallows a thought, and is handed a plate with sardines whose tiny bones shine like proof that the world can be intricate and merciful at once. Toward the brazier, the cook presses salt into fish with the tenderness owed to something that has travelled all day to be useful. A wedge of lemon leans its light over the plate. The scent rises like a hymn to stomachs and to memory. Outside, the Tagus rehearses the moon. Masts ink fine lines against a bruised gold sky. Oars touch water with the authority of habit. Inside, cups clink in the tone of small consent. Conversation learns to bob rather than stride. A door lifts and shuts to the hinge's own rhythm, admitting a strip of night as if it were an old friend given a quick seat by the wall. A mariner tells of fog that argued and then apologised with a sudden clarity. Another tells of a day when gulls wrote urgent letters and no one could read the language, so they stayed ashore and were grateful later. A monk, robe salt-dusted from a walk by the quay, accepts Caldo and describes how patience can be planted and harvested like beans. The room listens as if to weather that might be negotiated. The wine's second voice is a cool hand to the brow. It leaves the mouth clean, the heart measurable, the mind free to frame kinder sentences. Lamps find their slow vocabulary. A crease of music appears at the edge of the table. 4 notes, then 3, then the idea of a story that has no intention of finishing, and so everyone breathes more evenly. The brazier relaxes its glow. The room compacts itself into a smaller, tenderer geography. Elbow, cup, crumb, the soft click of a shell on clay. A man far from his own river confesses that salt tastes like home in every port. A woman whose father knew stars better than names says that home is any place where bread knows your bite. The cat considers this and sleeps. Later, when plates give back their shine to damp cloths and the last fish bone has been carried carefully to a pail that the dawn will thank, the tavern performs its closing seamanship. Cups are turned upside down like small boats in fair weather. Embers are spread thin so a dark can safely pass. The door is latched with a sound that belongs only to cities that trust their knights. He steps outside, and the alley receives him like a gentle corridor. Down slope, the river exhales, the castle keeps its quiet antiphon, and the sea, never far here, polishes its black silver until morning. In his mouth, the last taste is citrus and smoke, and a friendliness that will survive sleep. And somewhere beyond the straits and over long roads of forest and frost, where rivers carry honeyed breath instead of salt and winter keeps a stricter calendar, a wooden room waits by the Volkhov with mead the colour of late sunlight. Novgorod already lighting its lamps for a northern kind of warmth, where sweetness learns to be strong. Part 17. On the Volkhov, the evening gathers with a fur-scented patience, and a timbered room in Novgorod sets out mead like late sunlight poured into winter, sweetness that has learned to wear a fur-lined coat. He comes in through a door rubbed smooth by generations of mittens, and the room receives him with stove-warm breath, the white belly of a masonry oven purring in its corner, benches polished by wool and talk, walls of pine that keep the perfume of sap even after years of argument with frost. Above the lintel, a small painted icon looks down with the gentle severity of Northland holiness. A lamp winks, steady as a star that has forgiven clouds for their interference. Birch-bark canisters sit in a neat cohort, lids tied with reeds. A rack of fish, smoke, dark and tidy, leans near the oven like a well-behaved roomer. A basket of black bread wears a towel as respectfully as a guest. From the back, where the barrels are, a host approaches with a ladle, and that winter skill of moving slowly without wasting time. He dips and pours, and the cup brightens in his hand. A gold the colour of straw saved from summer, a honeyed bloom that remembers more flowers than the eye will see until May. The first sip is forgiveness, warm at the throat, low and steady in the chest. The second teaches the mouth that sweetness can be muscular and serious, not a flirtation, but a vow. The third draws a small circle around the body in which cold is allowed to stand outside and listen for a while. The room's rules are winter's rules, which is to say kindness drafted into law. Wet fur and the heaviest boots take the pegs nearest the door, so the heat can tutor them gently toward good behaviour. The old are seated by the oven without ceremony. Children are given the first bowls of soup, because hunger grows faster in small frames. Silence is allowed to sit at a table until it learns its words again. If someone arrives with the burnt look of ice on their cheeks, a neighbour will rub them briskly with a cloth and talk to the face until colour returns, as if the world could be argued back into blood. A samovar practices its steam in the corner like a modest volcano. Tea will appear when mead has taught the evening to be unafraid of softness. On the window ledge, a jar of cranberries glows like a handful of embers the river forgot. Outside, the snow edits sound into bigger, kinder shapes. Inside, wood speaks its smaller vocabulary. Stool legs confiding in floorboards, a ladle's tap against clay, the creak by which a beam admits history without complaint. At the long bench, a raftsman with rope creases in his palms, names rivers as if reciting saints, Mr. Sias Neva, and the room nods because it knows how timber travels, bound and patient, teaching water to carry forests toward cities that will need roofs. Beside him, a trader from beyond the lakes counts quietly with his lips. Wax, fur, flax, a bracelet of words that clinks like honest coin. He drinks between reckonings and lets the cup decide which numbers matter. A woman who keeps bees all summer and candles all winter adds a spoon of pollen to her tea and explains, in the plain grammar of those who work, that hives are households with stricter ethics and better bookkeeping. The table laughs with the respect due to cheerful precision. Near the stove, a boy threads a strip of leather through a new skating sole and is counselled by 6 aunts at once. His needle learns caution and pride in the same stitch. A pilgrim on his way to a monastery upstream warms his hands, says little, listens much. He looks toward the icon and then toward the window, as if heaven and snow were collaborators and he is trying to learn their project. Plates arrive that know how to hold heat. Cabbage and barley sighing into truce, a spoon-bright line of sour cream persuading the mouth that winter can be diplomatic, pancakes tender as good outcomes, a dollop of curds teaching their edges humility, mushrooms with the forest still in their pockets, cucumber gone, honest and sour, to remind sweetness that it has an equal. Black bread with its brick-brown patience receives butter like a letter from summer. A wedge of salt herring answers in its salt-law voice. Mead approves, enclosing opposites, as a host does guests who quarrel politely, and then find they were saying the same thing all along. Someone breaks open a clay pot and lifts out a ring of baked pike, the steam writing a soft-lipped alphabet that even the shyest appetite can read. Novgorod keeps peace as a civic craft, Disagreements are taken to the threshold for one breath of snow and returned in a better key. Boasts pay for a round. Sorrow earns one freely from the next table. Memory is a common pasture, not to be fenced. A fur cap is knocked free of snow over a basin, not in the middle of the floor. Knives are blunt at the nose and sharper in the purpose. Laughter starts low, so as not to alarm the icons. A travelling gusler plucks 3 strings and tries a line of an old byliney, until the song decides it would rather live as humming tonight. The room hums with him and lets the words sleep. A tax clerk drinks with the modesty of someone who has lived all day among numbers. He forgets them by degrees and regains his person. The host moves in slow circles that add up to arithmetic the stove could approve. Hot ladle to those who have cooled, cool water to those who have flushed. A second piece of fish placed where a first piece has been recognised as insufficient for a hard day. Tenderness here is logistics done to scale. Stories prove their woolen usefulness. An old woman remembers a carnival when the snow squeaked under boots like small birds. A man across from her tells of a thaw that let river ice loosen with a sigh loud as a church emptied after feast day. A traveller from Pskov swears by a hill where the wind will sell you advice for the price of 10 fingers held high. No one asks for more than an honest line in return. The room prefers examples to conclusions. On the shelf, a birch bark box keeps pepper that came a long way to learn how to help turn turnips into supper. It is pinched with the respect owed to foreign miracles that consent to be small. The mead's second voice arrives, drier, deeper, a logic underneath the amber. It does not hurry, and so breath slows to meet it. Palms flatten on the table, shoulders drop an inch. Eyes that spent the day squinting against bright snow loosen, as if night were a kind hand turned palm up. In that eased interval, plans are made in the northern way, not grand declarations but provisions. Waxed to the church by noon, sled runners greased at dawn, a parcel sent up river with a letter that says, "Only if convenient," and means, "We trust you." Someone at the corner proposes that sweetness is strongest when it remembers weather. The beekeeper raises her spoon and says, "Exactly," and the mead agrees by being present without insisting. Later, when the oven's breath has smoothed the last tightness from fingers and the window's rhyme has become a small museum of leafless ferns, the room begins its closing liturgy. Bowls stacked in a gentle architecture, crumbs brushed into a hand for the yard birds who will hold their parliament on the fence at first light, the ladle hung so its handle will not remember heat as ache. A man in a felt hat stands, bows toward the icon, then toward the host, then toward the door. Not as performance, merely as gratitude performed in the grammar that keeps roofs over heads in climates that do not apologize. The snow meets him without argument. The night has the blue-black depth of fur. A sleigh passes, its runners riding cursive on the street's clean sheet. Bells speak in their winter register, silver, small, sufficient. Sleep here is stiff at first, and then warm, like a new fur that has decided to be your fur. Dreams smell of honeycombs, opened with a warm knife, and of pine smoke polite enough to sit on the hem of a coat without trying to live there. The river keeps its black promise and moves under ice with the steady discretion of work done well. Morning will pull the white scarf tighter and send men to sledges, women to ovens, children to errands that become legends when told truthfully. And when the road swings south and bends toward a broader water where barges teach cities to face each other and speak in the language of markets, another tavern lights a lamp over brown tables, Buddha on the Danube with dark beer that thinks in chords, and a pot hung high over coals, the paprika just beginning to practice its red grammar, already making room for travellers who have learned. In the north, that warmth is both an ingredient and a policy. Part 18 in Buda, the Danube braids night into a long dark ribbon between hills that keep their shoulders close, and a trader's tavern above the river hangs a pot over coals so steady that stew becomes a philosophy, slow, red, persuasive. He steps into warmth that smells of wood smoke and sweet paprika beginning to speak its bright grammar. Onions have given up their sharpness to patience. Beef has learned the language of surrender, and a spoon resting across the pot carries the sheen of agreements kept. The room holds a brown, companionable light, tables rubbed to a low gloss by coats and ledgers, rafters crossed like careful wrists above a conversation that understands both caution and appetite. Near the hearth, a brazier keeps a secondary heat for bread, its crust crisping the way a decision crisps when it is finally made. Beside it, a board holds a parade of peppers in sober reds, caraway waiting like a wiser side, a small dish of sour cream that will later teach fire to behave kindly. Mugs of dark beer arrive with shoulders on them, foam a neat collar. The first mouthful is rye and roast and a shy sweetness. The second, a bass note that suggests boots on wooden planks and barges nudging the key. The third finishes like a chord that chooses to be complete without showing off. Buddha speaks two registers at once, river and road, and the tavern translates between them. A carter from the great plain warms his hands and names distances by days. A bargeman balances invisible weight on his palm to show how grain sits more patiently than salt. A clerk from the customs house sets his satchel under the bench and drinks with the slow exactitude of men who have lived all day inside numbers. Across from him, a fiddler on his supper break lets the bow sleep while he attends to stew and remembers the feel of a waltz shared among strangers. A woman who mends harness by lamplight offers the room a proverb. Leather learns the truth about a man sooner than neighbours do, and laughter nods its assent. The host, hearing the table's temperature rise, puts down an extra loaf because wit sharpens hunger. From the doorway the river slips in as a colder draught and is domesticated by rosemary. Somewhere a bell on a harness clinks like a small coin. The ceiling holds the noise gently, as if the rafters were a hand-cupped, round flame. The rules here are practical and almost affectionate. The wettest coat takes the peg nearest the door. The man with frost on his cap is asked no questions until the second ladle. The first bowl goes to the smallest appetite by age, not by pride. Quarrels must pay for a plate of pickled peppers before considering themselves legitimate. A widow's mug is refilled by the one with the widest belt, which is less a punishment than a lesson in proportion. Maps live without paper on the tables, Carpathian passes traced by finger joints, the bend below Esztergom measured by a thumb, the market at Pest tapped into the wood like an oath. A boy learns to carry 3 mugs without either spilling or apologising. He observes that the dark beer feels heavier than it weighs, and a bargeman tells him that is how winter behaves too. In a corner, a woman, with hands baked to a pleasant brown from ovens, shows a stranger that the trick of scattering caraway with economy, just enough to remind the mouth that memory is savoury, she says, and the pot agrees. Plates come in an order that keeps courage ahead of nostalgia. First, slices of bread pass like ballots for calm, then a ladle of stew, red as a modest sunset, steam-breathing logic into the cold. Afterward, a little dish of pickled cabbage, its clean sour correcting the fat without scolding, Finally, a curl of sour cream that persuades paprika to turn from trumpet to viola. Knives here are serviceable and shy. Spoons do most of the speaking. Forks behave like polite foreigners. The beer's second voice settles the room into longer sentences. Stories lengthen, details earn their keep, and the Danube's own kind of time begins to supervise the clock. Tides of voice, the occasional hush when wind noses at the shutters, the hush answered by a stir of logs, then by the slow punctuation of ladles against iron. Buddha's evening is a method. A horseman describes the road east, when snow makes the countryside seem reasonable, and then without warning, not. He draws a square in the air to indicate towns that stay put, and a wave to acknowledge drifts that do not. A bookseller from across the bridge admits that paper catches cold if you do not mind it. The room laughs kindly, and no one tests the theory. A man wearing the blunt coat of the garrison says nothing for a long time, and then a little, which is optimal. He mentions a fog that decided to forgive horses but not men, and the room leaves the story respectfully at that. The fiddler, fortified by stew, lets the bow wake and gives the room a tune that travels at table height. Stepwise, unhurried, someone hums harmony that knows better than to stand in front. The cat, like every cat in every harbour city, drafts itself into office and reviews the sources. It defeats a scrap of sausage and pretends it was a negotiation. Later, when hunger has been coached into memory and mugs learn the slope of their emptiness, the tavern shifts into its closing civility. A clerk lends the host a pencil to mark a tally that could be done by heart but should be written anyway because the river respects records. Crumbs are gathered for birds who will argue the sun up the hill. The hook beside the door accepts the last damp scarf without complaint. Someone speaks low about a bridge toll that cut too close and a boy needing boots. A jar appears from nowhere. Coins glance it with humility, and the jar disappears again, its route understood and left undescribed. The stew is banked like embers. Peppers are counted with the tenderness owed to small fires that have agreed to last until morning. He steps outside with the taste of paprika and wood on his tongue and feels the river assign him a quieter posture. The hills kneel into their own shadows. Barges rock in their sleep. The chain of lamps along the bank writes an argument for civilization that even winter acknowledges. Breath presses its white signature onto the air and drifts away toward Pest, where windows learn to be warmer by example. Far to the west, where river patience turns at last to tidal weather, and the sea salts its speech with lake-like confidence, another table is being laid for a different kind of hunger, La Rochelle with oysters that taste of bright knives, and a white wine that keeps its cool like a magistrate, already shucking moonlight and setting down bowls in which the Atlantic will be invited to behave. Part 19. Along La Rochelle's quays, the Atlantic lifts its clean blade and puts it down again, and a tavern near the salt depots, timbered and salt-stained, opens its door to a night that smells of tide and work, well counted. Inside, the room keeps a white, bright order, as if the sea had insisted on tidiness. Scrubbed boards, beams the colour of wet rope, tables set with crockery that remembers frostless mornings. A brazier hums, a steady consonant. A long plank by the window serves as a shucking bench. Oysters piled in wicker like pocket moons. Knives flashing small rehearsed mercies. Barrels are stacked too high against a wall that remembers storms. A chalk hand has drawn prices in a script that looks briefly like gulls. From the back, a cask of pale wine waits in its cradle, cool as good judgment, brisk mineral, the colour of a decision made before tempers could ruin it. Bread arrives in lean loaves with a bark that snaps. Butter sits pale and quiet. prepared to teach sharpness how to behave. The first oyster lifts, a hinge persuaded with a twist, liquor shining like a thought before speech. It meets the tongue with clean iron and sunlight in winter clothes. The wine follows and translates the sea into language the body can keep without saltburn. La Rochelle keeps two clocks, the markets and the tides. The tavern speaks both. Salt merchants with sleeves powdered white, as if winter had tried their cuffs, sit beside fishermen whose hands have learned to read the Atlantic in braille. Coopers, clerks, rope makers, a woman from the marshes with boots that have outlived 3 fashion cycles. Each finds the same bench because benches here prefer function to pedigree. A boy minds the door, wiping brine from a mat as if polishing the entrance to a church. He counts boats by the smell on coats. Near the fire, an iron pot worries mussels with garlic and herb. Steam carries the kind of promise that keeps a town patient. A pan takes a turn with small eels and a stern squeeze of lemon. Another tends onions until they surrender sweetness that can keep peace among sharper flavours. The room's grammar is appetite disciplined by weather, plenty but in lines, abundance with margins. Outside, the basins think in rectangles and mirrors. Inside, plates hold their own order. Oysters in rings, like family portraits. A dish of pickled something to keep pride in its chair. Bread in battalions ready to break and mend at once. Rules are brisk and kindly. The wettest coat meets the hook nearest the draught. Knives point toward the sea out of superstition. That is also courtesy. A quarrel must purchase a round of mussels before it can raise its voice. A widow's plate is refilled by the man who laughed loudest that hour. Newcomers are shown the hinge trick with an oyster knife. The wrist does the work, not the elbow, and are quietly watched until the blade learns mercy. If the shell wins, a cloth is produced before blood can embarrass hunger. In one corner, a ledger sits under a stone like a gull on a post. The host will add a neat column later. Wine, oysters, bread, arguments cooled, kindnesses recorded as if they were debts the house owes to the future. Stories run short here and sharply true. A pilot shows with 2 fingers where a sandbank has decided to live this winter. A netsman recounts a night when wind walked sideways and the fleet stayed home, and the town learned gratitude in the key of soup. A salt worker from the marshes explains the arithmetic of brine, sun for hours, wind for edges, patience for profit. And no one laughs because the city's silver is made from the sea's tears, and such jokes are not encouraged. A clerk from the weighhouse drinks slowly. His mouth finds stones in the wine and approves. He mentions, with modest pride, that today's tally squared without argument. The room listens in the civilized way of markets done right. No applause, but an extra slice of bread at the clerk's elbow, which is applause in this dialect. Plates move in a choreography that learned its steps from the tide, raw first, then warmed. Oysters with a drop of vinegar that woke while the market napped. Mussels in broth that tastes of patience and a small rebellion of garlic. A skate wing with capers brought by someone who swears they come from far coasts and might be right. A salad of something green that still thinks of fields under salt wind. A wedge of firm cheese that knows how to finish a conversation without being clever. The wine keeps its posture, cool, precise, a line drawn cleanly with a steel nib. It likes shellfish best, forgives onion, respects bread as a colleague. A jug of water sits companionably among cups. La Rochelle's tavern prefers hydration to heroics. At the shucking bench, an old man in a blue cap works at the speed of accurate weather. He flips shells into a basket, arranges their emptiness like a fan, and talks to them under his breath the way some men talk to horses, without expecting answer, expecting obedience. The sea sends in its announcements by door and by window a rope's wet thud, a gull's lawsuit, the varnished creak of something that has not decided whether to be ship or house. Inside the sound is domestic and briny, knives clicking against shell hinge, bowls addressing spoons, laughter toned by salt to a clearer ring. A traveller from inland, startled by the austerity of the wine, asks if sweetness can live here. The host points at the butter, and then at a child asleep on a bench, and says, "That is where softness keeps its house." A woman, with a market voice, but a private gentleness, teaches a boy to stack shells neatly, so the table looks like it meant to be beautiful. He learns quickly, as children do when beauty has rules. Later, when the heap of shells has grown into a pale can, and the chalk has added a few honest numbers to the day's account, the room leans toward closing with the exactitude required by tides. Knives are sheathed in cloth. The shucking bench is sluiced until it smells like rain and lemon. The brazier's breath is shortened into embers that will remember their task at dawn. The host tips a little wine into a bowl for the cat, who lives responsibly on the premises and audits the floor for lapses. The cat drinks as if absolving the house of any sins of luxury. Coins change hands without drama. A cart creaks past with barrels that will taste tomorrow of brine and oak. A last plate goes out to a sailor who will not explain why he is late and is not asked. He steps outside to a harbour that has put on its serious jewellery, lanterns stating their case along the quay, water correcting the stars into thin, wavering facts. Salt dries on his sleeve in a fine frost. Gulls practice sleep on one leg. The marshes exhale their square perfumes into a night that does not mind geometry. La Rochelle will rise early to count, to weigh, to mend. For now, it keeps watch with the calm of things that know their work. In his mouth, the aftertaste is steel and citrus, and a fragment of prayer to tides. And inland, where cliffs turn to hills and stone, learns another speech. A room awaits of chambers carved in sandstone and ale drawn from cool cellars under a city. Nottingham's Cave Tavern, the one that claims a journey in its name, preparing a cellar's hush and a bench cut from rock, ready to receive travellers who trust stories enough to follow them underground. Part 20. Under Nottingham's Castle Rock, where sandstone keeps a cool breath even in forgiving weather, a tavern is nested like a swallow's cup. Rooms carved from the hill, passages following the grain of earth, benches cut straight from stone, so the knight can sit down without argument, and a name that sounds like a dare or a blessing. A trip to Jerusalem promised from a doorway that has never seen the desert, and yet understands thirst. He steps from street into cave, from the grammar of houses to the hush of geology, and the air changes its mind, damp mineral, faintly yeasty, as if the hill itself were halfway to becoming bread. Lanterns hang from iron like patient fruit. Their halos graze pocked walls, where generations of palms have polished the grit to a gentle gloss. The room is small, and then larger than expected, a trick of curves and careful shadow, one chamber tethered to the next by a low arch, a stair that behaves like a memory, turning once, twice, and finding a cellar room where barrels keep their round counsels. A cask is tapped with a mallet, soft as a monk's knock. The ale blooms amber in the firelight, cool, mild, the kind of honest bitterness that speaks softly and is therefore believed. Mugs are thick because stone prefers weight to wit. Bread arrives with a crust that crackles like a good secret told carefully. Cheese, keeps a cave's polite humility. A pie exhales, steam that smells of thrift and comfort, onions persuaded, meat convinced by time rather than by heat alone. When he drinks, the sandstone answers with a silence that is not emptiness but welcome. The way a well answers a rope, I am listening, use me kindly. The rules of earth apply here. Sound travels in curves, laughter returns modestly, arguments are reduced to sensible size by ceiling and wall, as if sandstone were an older, quieter magistrate. The wettest cloak hangs nearest the mouth of the tunnel so the cave can civilize it by degrees. Torches are minded like livestock. The last seed is not the worst, because the last seed is the one that lets you look back and see how the hill holds the whole room in its palm. A miner with nails like iron filings sits where the light can forgive his day. A lace maker with hands so quick they seem to be remembered rather than moved turns her cup and listens. A carter takes the measure of the room, the way he measures a wagon, weight, balance, creak, and decides nothing here will tip. At one table, a knight's surcoat lives only in a story that has been mended and laundered by centuries. Men drank here before they rode for Jerusalem, says the wall, or the sign, or the man with eyebrows like hedges. Perhaps they did, perhaps they did not. But the stone permits the legend to sit at the table if it minds its manners and pays its round with wonder rather than with certainty. The tavern keeps a little museum of use, a shelf of clay bottles, like small sleeping geese, a niche where someone long ago carved across the size of a quiet admission, the faint shine where barrels have been racked and unracked until the rock remembers their circles. Marks cut in a jam in a year nobody agrees upon, measuring children who have long since turned into grandfathers in stories, the lines still here, still claiming inches from the wall, as if height were a currency you could leave to the next drinker. The cellar man moves with the economy of someone who trusts temperature more than chatter. He can tell if a cask has come ready by the accent the froth speaks when the spile is eased. His dog has learned the low geography of tunnels and sleeps in a draught of cool air, as if it were a philosophy. Plates arrive in generous underground portions. A pasty, heavy as a good promise. A trencher of peas and bacon that tastes like patience salted and set to simmer. A bowl of mushrooms that remember the forest but are content to be domesticated for an evening. The ale's second voice is quieter and kinder than the first, as if the cave had leaned close and advised moderation in the friendliest possible way. Somewhere a small spill of lamp smoke tries to invent a cloud and fails. The ceiling blackens at the edges of its own agreements with fire. Talk gathers in the round. A mason explains how stone prefers to be asked rather than told. A clerk from the Shire Hall admits that paper goes humble in damp. A woman whose grandmother told her that tunnels are a village's private weather describes how, on hot afternoons, she stands at this door and lets the cave breathe on her until her thoughts lie down and behave. A pilgrim badge is produced from a pouch, tin scallop, St. James's plain moon, and passed hand to hand. Each palm leaves it warmer, as if proof and blessing were the same metal. Stories here keep an honest leash. A soldier tells of a march that was harder than later songs maintained. He shortens it in the retelling, and everyone offers him the courtesy of not noticing. A boy repeats the sign's promise, trip to Jerusalem, liking the taste of distance without intending to leave. He asks whether camels feel like boats when they walk, whether dates are sweet for the right reasons. No one corrects him. A singer chooses a low air because echoes love low air. The tune finds a ledge and sits on it, companionable as a cat. When the door opens, the outer world contributes a scooped sound of hoof on cobble. A moth flicks the lantern like a tiny priest, and the cave accepts both as evidence that life continues at surface speed and underground speed without needing to be reconciled to night. Closing here is not a dismissal, but a slow remembering of rock. Mugs are rinsed and set lip down to cool. Crumbs are brushed into a palm that has carried crumbs for a very long time. The wick is pinched with the same two fingers that knotted a lacemaker's thread or set a rivet or signed a receipt for coal. The cave gives back its quiet. The last step up to the street is a small astonishment. A draught of night air, a few more stars than the lamplight admits, the castle shouldering the sky with the calm of long authority. Behind him, sandstone continues the work it began long before drinkers and will continue long after, keeping, cooling, holding, teaching impatience to sit down. He carries the taste of ale and cool rock, and a legend that decided to be gentle with itself. He carries also the ordinary strength of rooms that have made hunger into fellowship and thirst into grammar across centuries that argued loudly and then slept. The road waits above ground, north toward sea wind and fish scales, east toward forests that manufacture quiet, south toward rivers that practice persuasion. The tavern waits below, a small cathedral of damp light, asking no one to believe more than they wish, giving more rest than most of us think to request. He walks out into Nottingham's night, where chimneys draw thin lines and roofs remember rain, and feels the whole itinerary settling into a single mild presence, harbours and hillsides, guild halls and bridges, bells and braziers, bread and kindness. Somewhere, in some other city, a door is opening, and a room is beginning again its old miracle of warm light and lawful appetite, and far off, beyond the turnings of the street and the patience of sleep, morning already rehearses its gentle errands, laying out cups where hands will find them, counting logs, straightening chairs, ready to receive whoever arrives with a coin of hunger, and to give back change in peace.